Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. As the day settles, allow the residue of your conversations, the lingering weight of words spoken, and the social expectations of the hours past to gently dissolve. These echoes no longer require your energy. You are permitted to find rest in the stillness of this space, free from the obligation to respond or remain available to the world. If this chronicle provides a restful sanctuary, please subscribe and like the video to support our weekly histories. We value your quiet feedback on our narration and invite you to share which eras or figures you would like to hear us visit in future episodes. The focus of this account rests upon the immense arc of the 4th century BCE, observing how a single military and administrative machine redrew the maps of 3 continents. This is a persistent movement through ancient landscapes, encompassing the rugged northern valleys and the humid reaches of the Far East. The history begins now, in the shadow of the Macedonian hills. Chapter 1: The Highland Crucible. The limestone ridges of the Pindus and Shar mountains form the northern boundary of a world that, for much of the 4th century BCE, remained largely peripheral to the grander dramas of the Greek city-states. These highlands were a place of deep, shadowed forests and rushing river valleys, where the Haliakmon and Axios rivers carried the meltwater of the peaks down toward the fertile alluvial plains of the Aegean coast. Within this geography, the Kingdom of Macedonia existed as a collection of pastoral tribes and landed nobility, a society that appeared more ancient and less settled than the refined democracies of the south. The climate was one of extremes, defined by long, snow-silent winters in the upper elevations and humid, mosquito-heavy summers in the lowlands where the capital of Pella sat amidst the marshes. History records that the Aga dynasty, which claimed descent from the mythical Heracles, held a precarious grip on this frontier territory for generations. The survival of the kingdom was never a certainty, as it faced constant pressure from the Illyrian tribes to the west and the Thracians to the east. Meanwhile, the southern Greeks often viewed the Macedonians as little more than useful barbarians who spoke a strange northern dialect of their tongue. It was into this environment of constant regional friction that Philip II was born, a figure who would eventually replace the inherent fragility of the state with a rigid, professionalized structure that the world had not yet seen. During his formative years, Philip was sent to Thebes as a political hostage, a period of confinement that proved to be the most significant education of his life. He resided in the house of Pamenes and observed the tactical innovations of the great general Epaminondas, who had recently broken the long-standing military supremacy of Sparta. Philip watched as the Thebans utilized deep columns and specialized infantry formations, noting how a centralized command could move disparate units as a single, cohesive organism. When he finally returned to Macedonia to claim the regency and then the throne in 359 BCE, he carried with him a blueprint for a military machine that would be fueled by the kingdom's own natural resources. The professionalization of the Macedonian ranks began with the introduction of the sarissa, a formidable pike crafted from the dense, resilient wood of the cornel tree. These spears reached lengths of 18 feet, requiring the infantryman to use both hands to level the weapon, while a smaller shield was slung over the left shoulder. In the damp scent of the northern forests, workers harvested the cornel wood and seasoned it to ensure it would not snap under the weight of a charge, while blacksmiths in Pella worked late into the nights. The sound of this industry, the rhythmic hammering of bronze and the soaring of timber, became the heartbeat of a kingdom that was rapidly transforming its peasant farmers into a standing army. Administrative reforms accompanied this military growth, as Philip sought to tether the disparate highland nobility to the central authority of the crown. He established the institution of the royal pages, taking the sons of the aristocracy into the palace to be educated alongside the prince, a move that served as both a gesture of favor and a subtle method of ensuring the loyalty of their fathers. This centralized court culture created a new generation of commanders who were bound to the Argead line by shared childhoods and common ambitions. It was a subtle, institutional shift that turned a loose confederacy of lords into a focused political engine, one that Philip directed southward with increasing persistence. Marriage functioned as one of Philip's most effective diplomatic tools, used to secure the borders of his expanding influence through a series of strategic unions. In 357 BCE, he married Myrtale, the daughter of the king of the Molossians in Epirus, who would later take the name Olympias to commemorate a victory by Philip's racehorses at the Olympic Games. This union was intended to stabilize the western frontier, but it introduced a personality into the Macedonian court that was as formidable and uncompromising as Philip himself. Olympias was a devotee of the Dionysian mysteries, a woman of deep religious conviction who maintained her own private rites within the royal palace. Chroniclers of the era preserve a particular narrative regarding the domestic life of the royal couple, focusing on the queen's spiritual practices and the presence of serpents in her private quarters. It was reported that Olympias participated in the cult of Sabazios, and during her nocturnal rituals she was known to handle large, docile snakes that she kept in baskets near her bed. The sight of these creatures, often found winding through the incense-heavy air of the chamber or resting upon the royal linens, was said to have created a distance between the king and queen. These snakes were not merely pets, but were seen by Olympias as physical manifestations of the divine, a belief that would later feed the rumors that her son was the product of a celestial union rather than a mortal one. In the summer of 356 BCE, while Philip was engaged in the siege of Potidæa, a series of messengers arrived at his camp to deliver news that seemed to signal a shift in the fortunes of his house. He was informed that his general Parmenion had won a great victory over the Illyrians, that his horse had taken the prize at the Olympics, and finally, that Olympias had given birth to a son in Pella. This child, named Alexander, entered a world where the fires of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus were said to be burning on the very night of his birth. The historian Hegesias of Magnesia would later remark that the temple burned because the goddess was too busy assisting at the birth of the new prince to protect her own shrine. The upbringing of Alexander in the capital of Pella was defined by the dual influences of his parents and the shifting gravity of the Macedonian court. While Philip provided the model of the pragmatic, battle-hardened king who spoke the language of logistics and siege engines, Olympias provided a sense of destiny and a connection to the heroic past. She reminded the boy of his lineage, claiming that on her side he was a descendant of Achilles, the swiftest and most storied of the Greek warriors. This duality, the cold calculation of the father and the burning, mythic ambition of the mother, settled into the foundations of the boy's character as he moved through the limestone halls of the palace. As the Macedonian state grew in power, Philip's ambitions moved beyond the mere protection of his borders toward the total hegemony of the Greek world. Through a combination of bribery, diplomacy, and the occasional, devastating use of the phalanx, he brought the city-states of the south under his control. The Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE functioned as the final confirmation of this new order, where the 18-year-old Alexander led the companion cavalry in a decisive charge that broke the sacred band of Thebes. Following this victory, the League of Corinth was established, appointing Philip as the supreme commander of a pan-Hellenic alliance directed toward a singular goal: the invasion of the Persian Empire. The tactical framework that Alexander would eventually use to cross the world was built during these years of observing his father's campaigns. He saw how Philip utilized the hammer and anvil strategy, where the dense block of the infantry phalanx acted as the anvil to pin the enemy in place, while the heavy cavalry delivered the crushing blow like a hammer. He also observed the importance of engineering, as Philip's armies traveled with specialized units capable of constructing torsion catapults and massive siege towers. The army was no longer a seasonal gathering of men, but a traveling city of specialists, surveyors, physicians, and secretaries who recorded every detail of the terrain they crossed. Tensions within the royal family remained a constant, underlying current, particularly as Philip considered further marriages that threatened Alexander's status as the sole heir. The wedding of Philip to a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice led to a public confrontation that forced Alexander and his mother into a brief exile in Epirus. Though a formal reconciliation eventually allowed Alexander to return to Pella, the atmosphere of the court had turned brittle and suspicious. The young prince remained in the shadow of his father's immense success, a position that caused him to fear that Philip would leave nothing of significance for him to accomplish on his own. Preparation for the expedition to Asia proceeded with a quiet, relentless momentum throughout the spring of 336 BCE. Grain was stockpiled, horses were requisitioned from the northern pastures, and the treasury at Pella was emptied to fund the initial crossing of the Hellespont. Philip was at the height of his power, having unified the Greeks and built the most advanced military force in the Mediterranean. He moved with the confidence of a man who had already secured his legacy, unaware that the complex web of court intrigue and personal grievance he had woven was about to reach a violent conclusion. The stage was set for a transition that few could have predicted would happen so suddenly. During a grand celebration at Aige, the ancient ceremonial capital, Philip walked into the theatre without his bodyguard, a gesture intended to show his accessibility and safety among his people. It was in this moment of vulnerability that a member of his own royal guard, a man named Pausanias, stepped forward and ended the king's life. The assassination was swift, and in the chaos that followed, the military machine that Philip had spent 20 years building was suddenly without a driver. Alexander stood amidst the confusion of the court, a 20-year-old king who had inherited an empire on the brink of either total collapse or unprecedented expansion. The loyalty of the generals, the stability of the Greek alliance, and the gold in the treasury all hung in a delicate balance. He did not hesitate to step into the void left by his father, quickly securing the support of the army and eliminating any rivals to the throne with a cold, administrative efficiency. The Highland prince was now the hegemon of Greece and the master of the Macedonian machine, his eyes already turning toward the eastern horizon. The journey from the rugged crucible of the north toward the edges of the known world was no longer a plan. It was a reality in motion. Chapter 2: The Stagirite's Garden. Aristotle of Stagira arrived in the Macedonian court not as a stranger, but as the son of a royal physician, returning to a landscape he already understood with the specific clarity of a natural philosopher. Philip had chosen him to tutor the young Alexander with a very deliberate intention, seeking to temper the boy's Argead volatility with the structured logic of the Greek South. This invitation was accompanied by a promise to rebuild Aristotle's home city of Stagira, which Philip had previously razed, signaling that even the education of a prince was a transaction of statecraft. The philosopher accepted the task and moved the school away from the distractions of the capital to a more secluded setting, where the intellectual foundations of an empire could be laid in quiet. At Mysa, a village located in the foothills of Mount Bermion, the air was significantly cooler than the marshy heat of Pella, and the sound of falling water from nearby springs provided a constant rhythmic backdrop to their studies. The Nymphaeum, a sanctuary dedicated to the spirits of the water and woods, served as their classroom, featuring shaded stone walkways and tiered benches carved directly into the limestone. It was here that Alexander and his companions, the sons of the Macedonian nobility who would one day become his generals, spent 3 years immersed in a curriculum that spanned from the structure of the human soul to the migratory patterns of birds. This setting encouraged a particular kind of observational learning, as Aristotle believed that the physical world was the primary text from which all knowledge was derived. The students walked along the paths of the garden, discussing the principles of ethics and the nature of the polis, while the surrounding flora was treated as living evidence of biological classification. Lessons often drifted from the abstract to the concrete, shifting from a debate on the qualities of a just ruler to a quiet examination of the local soil and its capacity to sustain different varieties of grain. Beyond the formal lectures on politics and rhetoric, the education at Mysa was anchored by a deep engagement with the epic poetry of Homer, specifically the Iliad. Aristotle prepared a special edition of the poem for Alexander, which the young prince came to regard as a handbook for the warrior's life and a guide to the complexities of honor and grief. This scroll remained a physical constant for him, traveling in a precious casket and resting, according to later accounts, beneath his pillow alongside a small bronze dagger. The characters of Achilles and Patroclus became the archetypes through which Alexander interpreted his own relationships and his eventual place in history. A specific copy of this annotated text survived through the years of campaigning, its edges worn by constant handling and the humidity of various climates. Alexander found in the verses a vocabulary for his own ambitions, seeing the pursuit of arete, or excellence, as a task that required both physical prowess and intellectual rigor. He reportedly spent hours debating the motivations of the Trojan heroes, seeking to understand the precise balance between the demands of the individual and the obligations of the commander. It was a rigorous, internal training that ensured the young man would enter the world not merely as a soldier, but as a figure who viewed his life as a narrative linked to the heroic past. Beside the prince stood Hephaestion, a youth of similar age who became the closest of his companions and the mirror through which Alexander viewed his own progress. Their friendship was fostered in the relative isolation of the Stagirites' garden, away from the jealousies of the court at Pella and the political maneuvering of their fathers. They shared the same lessons and the same cooling water of the springs, forming a bond that Aristotle likely observed with the detached interest of a student of human nature. This relationship provided Alexander with a rare sanctuary of trust, a condition that would become increasingly scarce as the burdens of the crown descended upon him. The arrival of a massive, unruly Thessalian stallion at the court provided one of the earliest opportunities for Alexander to apply the observational methods he was learning from his tutor. The horse, named Bucephalus because of the broad shape of its head which resembled that of an ox, was offered to Philip for the enormous sum of 13 talents. But the animal proved so wild that no rider could approach it. As the king's grooms struggled with the beast, Philip grew frustrated and ordered the stallion taken away, believing it to be of no practical use for a cavalry-dependent army. Alexander noticed a detail that the experienced horsemen had missed in their struggle with the stallion's energy. He realized that Bucephalus was not reacting to the men themselves, but was being driven into a frenzy by the sight of his own shifting shadow on the ground before him. The prince asked for permission to try and calm the animal, a request that Philip granted with a mixture of amusement and skepticism. Alexander walked quietly to the horse and turned its head directly into the sun, so that its shadow fell behind it and out of its line of sight. The stallion settled almost immediately as the source of its terror vanished, allowing Alexander to stroke its neck and eventually vault onto its back without resistance. He rode the horse in a wide, controlled circle before returning to his father, the animal now completely submissive to his touch. Philip, watching the display from the edge of the training field, was said to have been moved to tears, famously remarking that Macedonia was too small a kingdom for a spirit that understood how to master such a beast. From that day forward, Bucephalus became Alexander's primary mount, carrying him across thousands of miles of varied terrain until the very end of their journey together. Intellectual curiosity remained a defining trait of the prince's character, even as his focus shifted toward the logistics of governance and war. During his time at Mysa, he developed an interest in medicine and the healing arts, often prescribing diets and treatments for his friends when they fell ill. He viewed the human body with the same analytical gaze that Aristotle applied to the natural world, seeking to understand the underlying causes of fever and the restorative properties of specific herbs. This training gave him a practical, grounded understanding of the physical needs of an army and the fragility of the men who composed it. Maps played an increasingly prominent role in their discussions as they reached the end of their time under Aristotle's tutelage. They studied the geography of the Persian Empire as it was understood through the writings of Herodotus and the accounts of Greek mercenaries who had traveled the royal road. They discussed the heights of the Taurus Mountains and the vastness of the Mesopotamian plains, conceptualizing the world as a space that could be measured, categorized, and eventually unified under a single administrative system. The education was not merely a gathering of facts, but the construction of a mental map that Alexander would eventually spend a decade filling with physical detail. While the philosophical training continued, the reality of Macedonian politics began to intrude upon the quiet of Mieza. At the age of 16, Alexander was recalled to Pella to serve as regent while Philip was away besieging Byzantium, a task that required the prince to move from the contemplation of ethics to the practical application of power. During this regency, he successfully suppressed a revolt by the Maedi, a Thracian tribe, and founded his first city, Alexandropolis, a precursor to the dozens of cities he would later establish across Asia. The transition from student to ruler was swift, yet the influence of the garden remained visible in the way he structured his commands. By the time the formal schooling at Mieza concluded, Alexander had acquired a rare combination of Macedonian military grit and Greek intellectual discipline. He had learned to value the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, but he also understood that knowledge was a tool of the sovereign. Aristotle returned to Athens to found the Lyceum, leaving his pupil with a final gift, a portable copy of the Iliad that would serve as the prince's constant companion. The teacher and the student diverged, one toward the quiet life of the mind and the other toward the noisy, dusty reality of the march. These years of quiet study formed the inner logic of the man who would soon find himself standing at the edge of the Hellespont. The curiosity fostered in the limestone walkways of the Nymphaeum would later manifest as a desire to send botanical specimens back to Greece and to bring historians and scientists along on his campaigns. As the shadow of Philip's death finally cleared the path to the throne, the prince stepped forward not just as a conqueror, but as an explorer of the world's furthest reaches. Chapter 3: The Crown of Thorns and Iron. The gold within the Macedonian treasury at Pella was more than a collection of wealth. It was a heavy, physical archive of the kingdom's rapid ascent under Philip II. These coins, many bearing the image of a chariot or the head of Zeus, represented the labor of the Pangaeon mines and the tribute extracted from the northern tribes. When the news of the king's assassination at Aige reached the capital, the clinking of this species slowed, replaced by the hushed, urgent footsteps of officials securing the vaults. It was a moment of profound stasis where the material power of the state waited for a hand to claim it. A silver diadem, light in weight but immense in its symbolic burden, was the physical object that transformed the young prince into the sovereign. This band of precious metal was not a flamboyant crown in the later imperial tradition, but a simple, woven ribbon of silver that signified the wearer's role as the first among equals. As Alexander accepted this token, he inherited a palace that was suddenly thick with the scent of unlit torches and the cold draft of empty corridors. The authority of the Argead line was no longer a theoretical concept studied in the gardens of Mieza. It was a tangible, pressing weight that required immediate and decisive movement. Within hours of Philip's burial, the new king moved to consolidate the loyalty of the military machine that stood at the gates of the palace. He stood before the Macedonian assembly, wearing the simple cloak of a soldier, and declared that while the name of the king had changed, the king's purpose remained immutable. The sound of thousands of sarissa pikes being struck against bronze shields echoed through the square, a rhythmic, metallic roar that confirmed the army's acceptance of their new commander. This vocal endorsement was the essential currency of Macedonian power, more vital in that moment than any coin in the treasury. Antipater, a senior general who had served Philip with unwavering competence, provided the necessary bridge between the old guard and the new sovereign. He moved through the ranks, ensuring that the veterans who had bled at Chaeronea saw in the son the same relentless drive they had admired in the father. It was a transition managed with administrative precision, as commands were issued and oaths were taken before the shock of the assassination could harden into a coup. Alexander recognized that his survival depended on the speed with which he could occupy the vacuum left by the fallen king. The cold math of succession required the removal of any figures whose lineage or ambition posed a threat to the stability of the crown. Attalus, a high-ranking general who had publicly insulted Alexander's legitimacy, was eliminated in a swift, professional maneuver that signaled the end of the recent court factions. Amyntas, a cousin with a competing claim to the throne, was also removed from the board with the same quiet finality. These were not acts of emotional vengeance, but the grim, mechanical requirements of a dynasty that could not afford the luxury of internal dissent while the borders remained fragile. Southward, the Greek city-states viewed the news from Aegae as a signal for liberation, believing that the boy king would lack the experience and the stomach to maintain his father's hegemony. In Athens, the orator Demosthenes appeared in public wearing a celebratory crown of flowers, despite being in mourning for his own daughter, to herald the end of Macedonian tyranny. Thebes and the Peloponnesian states began to move toward open revolt, assuming that the northern kingdom would soon collapse into a protracted civil war. They miscalculated the tempo at which the new king was capable of moving across the landscape. Thebes, a city of ancient walls and deep-seated pride, became the focus of this emerging resistance as it expelled its Macedonian garrison. The Theban leaders believed the rumors that Alexander had been killed during a northern campaign against the Triballians, a falsehood that encouraged them to take an uncompromising stance. They did not realize that the king was already marching south with a speed that defied the logistical expectations of the time. The Macedonian phalanx moved like a single, iron-shod entity, covering hundreds of miles with a persistence that left the Greek cities stunned and unprepared. Upon his arrival at the gates of Thebes, Alexander offered the city multiple opportunities to surrender and return to the terms of the League of Corinth. He waited for several days, allowing the Thebans to observe the scale of the force arrayed against them and to reconsider the path of total confrontation. The air around the city was still, save for the occasional sound of a horse's whinny or the distant calling of a bird over the Boeotian plains. This pause was not a sign of hesitation, but a deliberate extension of the historian's mercy, providing a final moment of choice before the machinery of the siege was engaged. The destruction of Thebes, when it finally arrived in 335 BCE, was executed with a thoroughness that was intended to serve as a permanent strategic deterrent. The Macedonian troops, joined by local allies who harbored long-standing grievances against the city, breached the walls and moved through the streets with a focused, low-energy efficiency. This was not a chaotic riot, but a systematic dismantling of a regional power. When the fighting concluded, 6,000 Thebans lay dead and 30,000 more were rounded up to be sold into slavery, their voices a low, collective murmur in the dust of the valley. History records a single, quiet exception to this general devastation, which occurred amidst the smoke and the settling debris of the residential districts. As the soldiers moved from house to house with orders to level the city to the ground, Alexander issued a specific command to preserve the home of the poet Pindar, who had died a century earlier. The king, remembering his lessons at Mysa, wished to honor the man who had celebrated the triumphs of the Greek world in verse. While the surrounding structures were reduced to rubble and the walls of the Cadmea were razed, this one house remained standing. a solitary, silent monument to the intellectual continuity the king intended to carry into Asia. This calculated brutality had the desired effect on the remaining Greek states, as Athens and Sparta quickly reaffirmed their loyalty to the Macedonian throne. Thebes was not merely defeated, it was erased from the political map, its territory divided among its neighbors, and its name serving as a cautionary tale for those who might contemplate rebellion. Alexander had demonstrated that he possessed his father's tactical mind, but with a streak of uncompromising finality that Philip had often tempered with diplomacy. The boy king was now recognized as the undisputed hegemon of the Greeks. With Greece quieted and the northern borders secured, the focus of the court returned to the logistics of the great expedition. The treasury was once again a place of intense activity, as the final funds were allocated for the transport of the army across the Hellespont. Weapons were sharpened, grain was packed into leather sacks, and the horses were inspected for the long journey ahead. The atmosphere in Pella was one of focused anticipation, a collective holding of breath before the first step was taken onto a foreign shore. By the spring of 334 BCE, the movement of men and material toward the coast began in earnest, a procession that stretched for miles along the dusty roads of the Chalcidice. This was the largest and most specialized force ever assembled by the kingdom, a mobile civilization that carried its own blacksmiths, architects, and chroniclers. Alexander rode at the head of the companion cavalry, the silver diadem hidden beneath a practical iron helmet, his gaze fixed on the narrow strip of water that separated him from the Persian world. As the army reached the shores of the Hellespont, the transition from the old world to the new was finally at hand. The king stood on the deck of his galley, looking toward the plains of Troy, where the stories of his ancestors were rooted in the soil. The crossing was not merely a military maneuver. It was the closing of a chapter in the history of the Highlands and the opening of a chronicle that would span 3 continents. The water of the strait was calm, reflecting the pale light of a rising sun as the first keels touched the sands of Asia. Chapter 4: The Shores of the Hellespont. In the spring of 334 BCE, the movement of 35,000 soldiers and 5,000 cavalry transitioned from the dusty roads of Thrace to the literal edge of the Persian world. The crossing of the Hellespont was a logistical undertaking that required the coordination of over 160 triremes and cargo vessels, which shuttled the men across the narrow strait between Sestos and Abydos. As the current of the waterway pulled at the hulls of the ships, the transition felt less like a military maneuver and more like a permanent migration into the unknown. The sun rose over the hills of Asia, casting long shadows across the deck where the king stood, watching the distant shore resolve into focus. The air carried the sharp, brine-heavy scent of the sea, a smell that mingled with the leather and iron of the gathered infantry. Soldiers sat on their shields, observing the rhythmic dipping of the oars and the steady progress of the transport barges that carried the heavy baggage and the siege engines. This water was the traditional boundary between the Greek and Persian spheres, a psychological threshold that had remained largely uncrossed by a Western army for generations. Every man on board was aware that the return journey was not guaranteed, and the silence on the decks reflected the weight of that realization. As the royal galley approached the southern shore near the site of ancient Troy, Alexander took the helm and steered the vessel toward the sandy beach himself. Before the keel had even settled into the silt, he leapt into the shallow surf, fully armored, and cast his spear into the soil of Asia, declaring the land won by the spear. He then proceeded to the site of Ilion, where he offered sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles, while his companion Hephaestion laid a wreath at the tomb of Patroclus. It was a moment of deliberate, quiet ceremony that served to anchor the current campaign in the heroic continuity of the past, signaling to the army that they were not merely invaders, but the executors of an ancient destiny. The march inland followed the coast, moving through a landscape that was lush and fertile, filled with orchards and vineyards that had seen little of war in recent years. Alexander maintained a strict discipline among his troops, forbidding the plundering of the local villages to preserve the resources of the territory he intended to rule. This administrative restraint was a departure from the traditional modes of Greek warfare, which often relied on immediate pillage to sustain the march. Instead, the army relied on its own well-organized supply train, a long procession of pack animals and carts that carried the grain and wine necessary for the initial stages of the campaign. Farther to the east, the Persian satraps of Asia Minor gathered at the town of Zelea to discuss their response to the Macedonian arrival. Among them was Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary commander of great experience who urged a scorched earth policy. He suggested that the Persians should retreat and burn the crops, depriving Alexander of the local supplies he needed to maintain his momentum. Memnon understood that the Macedonian treasury was limited and that the king could not afford a prolonged war of attrition. His advice, however, was met with resistance from the Persian governors, who were unwilling to see their own provinces devastated by their own hands. Arsaces, the satrap of Hellespont in Phrygia, declared that he would not permit a single house in his territory to be burned, a sentiment echoed by his fellow governors who trusted in the superiority of their cavalry. They chose instead to meet Alexander in open battle, selecting a position along the banks of the Granicus River where the steep, muddy slopes would offer a defensive advantage. The Persian forces occupied the high ground of the eastern bank, their lines of cavalry stretching for miles and their Greek mercenary infantry held in reserve. They waited in the afternoon heat, the sound of the river's flow the only constant in a landscape that was quickly filling with the glitter of Persian gold and iron. When the Macedonian army reached the western bank of the Granicus, the sun was already beginning to descend toward the horizon, casting a golden light across the moving water. Parmenion, the veteran general, observed the depth of the river and the steepness of the opposing bank, advising the king to wait until the following morning to attempt a crossing. He argued that the Persian cavalry would be at a disadvantage if the attack were launched under the cover of a pre-dawn mist. Alexander, however, rejected the delay, stating that the Hellespont would blush with shame if, after crossing the sea, they were halted by a mere stream. The tactical decision to move immediately was driven by a desire to maintain the psychological pressure of the Macedonian advance. Alexander led the right wing of the army, composed of the companion cavalry and light infantry, into the riverbed where the water reached the chests of the horses. The sound of the river pebbles shifting under the weight of thousands of hooves created a low, grinding rumble that rose above the splashing of the water. The current was swift, tugging at the riders and threatening to break the formation as they moved toward the Persian line. The struggle at the river's edge was characterized by a dense, pushing movement of men and animals on the muddy slopes. As the first Macedonian units reached the eastern bank, they were met by the full weight of the Persian cavalry, who threw their javelins from the safety of the higher ground. The fighting was close and heavy, lacking the grand maneuvers of a plain. It was a contest of individual stamina and the persistence of the Macedonian spear. In this chaos, Alexander was nearly killed when a Persian satrap named Rosseses struck his helmet with a battle axe, only for the king to be saved by the swift intervention of Cletus the Black, who severed the attacker's arm. Eventually, the weight of the Macedonian phalanx, which had followed the cavalry into the river, began to tell upon the Persian center. The pikes of the infantry created an impenetrable wall that pushed the Persian horses back from the bank, creating a breach through which the rest of the army could pour. As the Persian cavalry formation disintegrated and fled into the interior, the Macedonian forces surrounded the Greek mercenary infantry who had remained stationary on the ridge. These mercenaries were treated not as soldiers of a sovereign power, but as traitors to the Greek cause, and the majority were either killed or sent in chains to the mines of Macedonia. In the aftermath of the victory, the king visited the wounded, inquiring after their injuries and allowing them to recount their deeds in the heat of the battle. He also commissioned statues to be carved of the 25 companions who had fallen in the first charge, ensuring their names would be preserved in bronze at the sanctuary of Zeus in Dium. This attention to the individual soldier was a hallmark of the Argead style, a method of building a loyalty that transcended the simple contract of service. The army saw in their leader not just a strategist, but a man who shared the dust and the risk of the front line. To signal the significance of the victory to the Greek world, Alexander sent 300 Persian panoplies, complete sets of armor and shields, to be dedicated at the Parthenon in Athens. Each set bore an inscription stating that they had been taken by Alexander and the Greeks, with the notable exception of the Lacedaemonians who had refused to join the expedition. It was a subtle, diplomatic move designed to reinforce the pan-Hellenic nature of the war while simultaneously shaming the Spartans for their neutrality. The news of the Granicus victory rippled through the Aegean, causing the coastal cities of Ionia to reconsider their allegiance to the great king. Sardis, the administrative heart of the Lydian satrapy and a city of immense wealth, surrendered without a blow as the Macedonian army approached its gates. The king moved into the citadel and restored the ancient laws of the Lydians, a gesture of administrative continuity that helped to stabilize the province. He also began the construction of a temple to Zeus on the site of the former royal palace, effectively reclaiming the landscape for the Hellenic world. The wealth of the Sardian treasury provided a much-needed infusion of gold for the army, allowing the king to pay his troops and fund the next stage of the march. The movement down the coast toward the great port cities of Ephesus and Miletus became a journey of liberation rather than conquest. In city after city, the democratic factions overthrew the Persian-backed oligarchies and welcomed the Macedonian advance with festivities and dedications. Alexander appeared at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, offering to pay for its ongoing reconstruction if his name were inscribed upon it, an offer the Ephesians politely declined by stating it was improper for one god to build a temple for another. The king accepted the refusal with a quiet grace, content to let his influence grow through presence rather than force. As the army settled into winter quarters along the Carian coast, the focus shifted toward the naval problem that the Persian fleet still posed in the Aegean. Alexander made the strategic decision to disband his own fleet, choosing instead to defeat the Persian navy by capturing the ports from which it operated. This land-based naval strategy required the army to move through the rugged terrain of Lycia and Pamphylia, where the mountains met the sea in sheer cliffs and narrow passes. The chronicle of the coast was far from over, and the road to the east now lay through the mysterious interior of the Anatolian plateau. Chapter 5: The Knot and the Narrow Pass. The strategic necessity of neutralizing the Persian fleet by land, rather than engaging it upon the unpredictable waters of the Aegean, forced the Macedonian advance into the rugged, cedar-scented interior of Phrygia. By choosing to move away from the coast, Alexander was effectively severing his own immediate line of retreat, a consequence that turned the army's gaze permanently eastward toward the Anatolian heartland. This shift signaled a change in the character of the expedition, moving it from a localized liberation of Ionian Greeks into a direct challenge to the administrative core of the Achaemenid Empire. The roads were ancient, carved into the high plateau by generations of Lydian and Phrygian kings. They carried the sound of the Macedonian baggage train deep into territory where the authority of the great king had remained unchallenged for centuries. Winter gave way to a crisp, high-altitude spring as the army converged on the city of Gordium, the ancestral capital of the Phrygian kings, located along the banks of the Sangarius River. The city served as a vital junction for the royal road, a place where the trade routes from the east met the paths leading to the Mediterranean. Here, the Macedonian soldiers found a moment of rest within the ancient citadel, where the air was thinner and the light held a clarity that seemed to sharpen the outlines of the distant mountains. In the center of the Acropolis stood an ancient wagon of cornel wood, dedicated to Zeus by Midas or his father Gordius, which had remained a focal point of local legend for hundreds of years. According to the tradition of the region, the yoke of this wagon was fastened by a knot of cornel bark so intricate that no ends were visible, having been woven with a complexity that defied the logic of the hand. A prophecy was attached to the object, stating that whoever could untie the knot would become the master of all Asia, a claim that had turned the wagon into a quiet monument of thwarted ambition for many travelers. In the stillness of the temple, the leather of the bindings had long since hardened into a substance as tough as the wood itself, having weathered the dry air of the plateau until it appeared as a single, seamless mass. Inside the dim warmth of the Acropolis, Alexander stood before the wagon, surrounded by his senior commanders and the local Phrygian priests who watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The king examined the knot for some time, his fingers tracing the weathered grain of the bark as he sought a point of entry that the centuries had hidden from view. The silence in the chamber was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of a guard's spear butt hitting the stone floor outside. Finding no way to unravel the cord by traditional means, Alexander stepped back and drew his sword in a single, fluid motion. He severed the knot with a heavy downward stroke that exposed the hidden ends of the bindings. This solution, characterized by its sudden and uncompromising nature, was interpreted by the Macedonian seers as a confirmation of the king's destiny to rule the East. Thunder was said to have rolled across the Phrygian sky that evening, providing a celestial endorsement of the act that the army accepted as a sign of divine favor. The Gordian knot thus passed from a physical puzzle into a metaphor for the king's approach to the obstacles of the campaign, a preference for the decisive strike over the patient unraveling of tradition. With this psychological victory secured, the march resumed, descending from the high plateau toward the humid plains of Cilicia. Movement through the Taurus Mountains required the army to navigate the Cilician Gates, a narrow pass where the limestone walls rose so steeply that the sky was reduced to a thin ribbon of blue above the heads of the men. The path was so restricted that in several places, 2 armed soldiers could barely walk abreast, making the passage a point of extreme vulnerability, where a small force could have halted the entire invasion. However, the Persian defenders abandoned their positions at the sight of the Macedonian vanguard, allowing Alexander to pour his troops through the mountains and down toward the city of Tarsus. The heat of the lowlands was a sudden, heavy weight after the coolness of the peaks. The army settled into the city to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with the main Persian force. During this period of preparation, the king fell into a dangerous, lingering fever after bathing in the Cydnus River, whose waters were famously cold even in the height of summer. The sudden chill seized his limbs, and for several days, the entire expedition was held in a state of anxious suspension. Alexander lay in the palace at Tarsus, his breathing shallow and his skin pale. It was during this vulnerability that he received a letter warning him that his physician, Philip the Acarnanian, had been bribed by the Persians to poison him. In a quiet display of trust that would be remembered by his inner circle, Alexander handed the letter to the physician and then immediately drank the medicine Philip had prepared, watching the man's face as he read the accusation. The fever broke within 48 hours, and the king emerged from his recovery to find that Darius III, the great king of Persia, had finally arrived in northern Syria with a massive imperial army. Darius had moved his forces across the Euphrates and was positioned on the vast plains of Sochi, where his superior numbers and heavy cavalry could be utilized to their full extent. The Persian host was a traveling empire in its own right, accompanied by the royal family, a vast baggage train of gold and silk, and thousands of personal attendants who served the court. The scale of the force was intended to be an overwhelming statement of Achaemenid power, a weight that would simply crush the Macedonian interloper. Strategic miscalculation led Darius to move his army away from the open plains and into the narrow coastal strip of Issus, seeking to trap Alexander against the sea and the mountains. By entering this confined geography, the great king inadvertently nullified his primary advantage of numerical superiority, crowding his infantry into a space where they could not maneuver. The Pinarus River, a small stream that ran through the plain of Issus, became the dividing line between the two powers, its banks muddy and slick with the late autumn rains. The air was thick with the scent of sea salt and the smoke of thousands of campfires as the two kings finally faced one another across the water. The Battle of Issus, fought in November 333 BCE, was defined by the density of the struggle and the directness of the Macedonian charge. Alexander led the companion cavalry on the right wing, driving through the Persian left and wheeling inward toward the center where Darius stood in his high royal chariot. The sound of the engagement was a continuous, dull roar of bronze against iron, punctuated by the high, sharp cries of the horses as they struggled for footing in the river silt. As the Macedonian phalanx held the center against the Persian mercenaries, the pressure of the cavalry charge began to break the resolve of the royal guard. Seeing the Macedonian pikes and the heavy cavalry closing in upon his position, Darius chose to abandon his chariot and flee the field on horseback, leaving his army without a central command. The flight of the great king acted as a signal for the general collapse of the Persian lines, as the vast host turned and attempted to squeeze through the narrow passes behind them. Thousands were trampled in the frantic retreat, and the baggage train, filled with the unimaginable wealth of the empire, fell into the hands of the Macedonian pursuers. The victory was absolute, and for the first time, the myth of Persian invincibility was shattered in the presence of the great king himself. Amidst the settling dust of the battlefield, the royal pavilion of Darius remained standing, a structure of immense luxury that contained the wife, mother, and children of the Persian monarch. Alexander entered the tent not as a despoiler, but as a sovereign who understood the administrative value of chivalry. He treated the royal women with a quiet, formal respect, ensuring they were protected by their own guards and allowed to maintain their royal status within the Macedonian camp. This administrative grace helped to pacify the local populations and signaled that the king intended to replace the Achaemenid dynasty rather than merely destroy it. The capture of the Persian royal family and the massive treasury at Damascus provided the expedition with the resources necessary for years of continued campaigning. Gold and silver, once locked in the vaults of Susa, now flowed into the Macedonian camp in such quantities that the soldiers found themselves weighted down by the spoils of the day. Yet, rather than pursuing the fleeing Darius into the interior of the empire, Alexander made the strategic decision to continue his march southward along the Phoenician coast. He recognized that as long as the great naval bases of the Levant remained in Persian hands, his empire was vulnerable to a maritime counterattack. As the army moved away from the blood-stained plains of Issus, the path led toward the ancient and wealthy cities of Phoenicia. The transition was one of increasing complexity, as the king began to receive embassies from cities like Byblos and Sidon, each seeking to secure their own future in the new Mediterranean order. The chronicle was shifting from the open field of battle toward the long, patient work of siege warfare and urban capture. Ahead lay the island fortress of Tyre, a city that believed itself to be unreachable by any force of the land. Chapter 6. The Island in the Sea. The island fortress of Tyre sat nearly half a mile off the Levantine coast, a limestone bastion surrounded by deep, azure waters that had protected its merchant princes for centuries. To the Macedonians standing on the shore, the city appeared as a sheer-walled mountain rising directly from the Mediterranean. Its two harbors bustled with the triremes of a naval power that had colonized the far reaches of the known world. The air was thick with the scent of the sea, and the distinct, pungent aroma of the murex snail pits, where the famous Tyrian purple dye was produced in quantities that fueled the city's immense wealth. It was a place that viewed itself as a sovereign entity, unreachable by any army that lacked a fleet to command the waves. 700 yards of open water formed a psychological and physical barrier that Alexander's predecessors, including the great kings of Assyria and Babylon, had struggled to overcome. While other Phoenician cities like Sidon and Byblos had peacefully accepted the new order after the Battle of Issus, the Tyrians sought a middle path, offering the king a golden crown of friendship while denying him entry to their island. They specifically refused his request to offer a sacrifice at the ancient temple of Melkart, whom the Greeks identified with Hercules. They claimed that the true ancestral sanctuary lay within the city walls where no foreigner was permitted to go. This diplomatic impasse, though couched in the language of religious tradition, was a fundamental challenge to the king's authority over the coast. History records that Alexander viewed the submission of Tyre as the linchpin of his Mediterranean strategy, as the city served as the primary base for the Persian-aligned Phoenician fleet. To leave it undefeated behind him would be to invite a naval insurrection that could sever his supply lines to Macedonia and Greece. In a council of his senior commanders, he articulated a plan that defied the conventional limits of siege warfare. If the city could not be reached by sea, the army would bring the land to the city. The decision was made to construct a massive mole or causeway across the channel, a project of engineering that would permanently alter the geography of the Levantine shoreline. Construction began with the dismantling of Old Tyre, the abandoned mainland settlement, which provided a ready supply of stone and timber for the foundation of the mole. Thousands of soldiers and local laborers carried heavy blocks of limestone to the water's edge, where they were tipped into the sea to create a stable base 200 feet wide. As the causeway pushed further into the channel, the water deepened, requiring an ever-increasing volume of material to maintain the progress. The sound of this labor, the rhythmic splash of stone hitting the water and the shouting of the overseers, became the ambient noise of the coast for the next 7 months. A rhythmic, persistent movement of men and carts defined the daily life of the camp as the mole crept toward the island walls. To protect the workers from Tyrian projectiles, the Macedonians constructed 2 massive wooden towers at the end of the causeway, covering them with raw hides to deflect fire arrows. These structures were among the largest ever seen in ancient warfare, housing catapults that could hurl stones at the Tyrian battlements while the laborers worked in their shadow. The project was a testament to the administrative discipline Philip had instilled in the army, functioning as a mobile construction site that never ceased its forward momentum. As the mole reached within range of the city's walls, the Tyrians launched a sophisticated maritime counterattack that nearly derailed the entire operation. They prepared a massive fireship, filling an old transport vessel with dry brush, sulfur, and bitumen, and weighting it so that it sat low in the water. Under the cover of a favorable wind, they towed the ship toward the mole and ignited it, sending a towering column of black smoke into the sky. The resulting inferno consumed the Macedonian siege towers and destroyed much of the wooden scaffolding, a setback that forced Alexander to reconsider the scale of his naval requirements. From the shore at Sidon and Byblos, the king began to gather a new pan-Phoenician fleet, recognizing that the mole alone could not breach the city without naval support. He was joined by the kings of Aradus and Enelus, who brought their own triremes into the Macedonian service, along with a significant contingent from Cyprus. This assembly of ships transformed the siege into a dual-front operation, as the island was now blockaded from the sea, while the mole was rebuilt with even greater width and strength. The engineering became more specialized, with the introduction of floating siege engines, catapults mounted on pairs of triremes that had been lashed together for stability. Within the city, the Tyrians watched the closing of the Iron Ring with a mixture of religious fervor and tactical desperation. They sent their women and children to the colony of Carthage for safety and began to utilize every resource at their disposal to thwart the Macedonian progress. To counter the underwater rams of the ships, they dropped large blocks of stone into the sea to foul the channels, and they heated sand in giant bronze shields to pour onto the Macedonian soldiers below. The sand, glowing red with heat, would seep through the gaps in the armor and burn the skin, a method of defense that the chroniclers recorded with a particular lingering horror. To counter these obstacles, Alexander's engineers developed specialized dredgers to clear the sea floor, working under the constant threat of Tyrian divers who attempted to cut the anchor cables of the ships. It was a slow, grinding contest of technical ingenuity, where every yard of progress was earned through the patient application of force. The king himself was often present on the mole or the ships, observing the work of the architects and occasionally offering his own interpretive corrections to the placement of the engines. This presence ensured that the logistical tempo remained high, even as the months of the siege dragged into the summer heat. It was during these final, tense weeks of the blockade that the king is said to have experienced a dream that influenced the timing of the final assault. He envisioned Hercules reaching out to him from the battlements of Tyre, an image that the seer Aristotle interpreted as a sign that the city would be taken, albeit with great effort. This dream served to bolster the morale of the troops, who had become weary of the constant, grueling labor of the mole. The narrative of the campaign was once again anchored in the mythic tradition, providing a psychological bridge between the physical reality of the siege and the perceived destiny of the Argead house. Reaching the walls with the floating towers finally allowed the Macedonians to engage the Tyrian defenders in direct hand-to-hand combat. These towers, known as helepolis or city-takers, were clad in iron plates to protect against fire and featured multiple levels of catapults and boarding bridges. The final breach was made not at the mole, where the defenses were strongest, but at a section of the southern wall that had been weakened by the constant pounding of the ship-borne rams. A small section of the masonry crumbled into the sea, creating a narrow, jagged opening through which the first wave of guardsmen could pass. The final assault was a multi-pronged maneuver that saw the Macedonian fleet force its way into both the northern and southern harbors simultaneously, while the main force crossed the boarding bridges onto the battlements. Alexander led the charge onto the wall himself, standing amidst the spray of the sea and the dust of the collapsing stone as he fought his way toward the royal palace. The city, which had resisted for 7 months, fell in a single violent afternoon of street fighting. The persistence of the defense had embittered the Macedonian troops, and the resulting sack was characterized by a thoroughness that mirrored the earlier destruction of Thebes. Following the fall of Tyre in July 332 BCE, the king finally offered his long-delayed sacrifice at the Temple of Melkart, dedicating the siege engine that had made the first breach to the god. The city was not entirely destroyed, but it was stripped of its naval power and placed under the governance of a Macedonian garrison. Its survivors were sold into slavery or executed as a warning to other coastal strongholds. The mole, however, remained, eventually accumulating silt over the centuries until the island was permanently joined to the mainland. The geography of the Levant had been rewritten by the king's refusal to accept the boundaries of the natural world. Southward, the road toward Egypt remained obstructed by the fortress of Gaza, a city perched atop a high sand hill at the edge of the desert. Gaza was the final gateway to the Nile, commanded by a eunuch named Batis, who had stockpiled enough grain to withstand a long blockade. The city's position made the use of traditional siege engines difficult, as the soft sand of the surrounding dunes would not support the weight of the massive towers used at Tyre. To overcome this, Alexander's engineers constructed a vast earthen mound that completely encircled the city, raising the Macedonian engines to the level of the walls. At Gaza, the fighting was as intense as it had been at Tyre, and it was here that the king suffered a significant wound to his shoulder from a Persian catapult bolt. The projectile pierced his shield and his breastplate, sinking deep into the muscle and forcing him to retire from the front line for several weeks. Despite the pain and the lingering fever from the injury, the king insisted on directing the final stages of the siege from his litter. When the city finally fell after 2 months, the resistance was met with the same uncompromising finality that had become the hallmark of the coastal campaign. The journey toward the delta of the Nile was now clear, and the army moved into the cooling shade of the Egyptian palm groves with a sense of relief after the dust of the Levant. The transition was one of atmosphere and political register, as the Macedonians left behind the defiant merchant cities for a land that viewed the king as a liberator. Egypt, with its ancient temples and predictable river, waited in the silence of the desert, ready to offer the prince a title that even Aristotle had not envisioned. Chapter 7: The Oracle and the Crown of the Two Lands. The transition from the scorched sands of Gaza to the humid, alluvial richness of the Nile Delta was marked by a shift in the very scent of the air, as the dry heat of the Levant gave way to the damp, vegetal fragrance of the river. For the Macedonian soldiers, who had spent months in the dust of sieges, the sight of the papyrus reeds and the vast, slow-moving current of the Nile offered a moment of sensory relief. Egypt was a land that existed in a state of deep administrative silence, having endured centuries of Persian rule with a quiet, persistent resentment that was now channeled into the welcoming of a new sovereign. There was no resistance at the border, no rattling of spears at the gates of Pelusium. Instead, the gates were opened, and the king was invited into a landscape that measured time by the rising of the water rather than the fall of dynasties. Egyptian priests and officials met the army with a formal grace that suggested Alexander was being viewed not as a foreign conqueror, but as the restorer of an ancient and sacred order. In Memphis, the traditional capital of the Old Kingdom, the Macedonian prince was greeted by the high priest of Ptah and presented with the formal regalia of the pharaohs. This acceptance of the local religious hierarchy was a deliberate departure from the previous Persian administrations, which had often shown a perceived lack of respect for the Egyptian temples and the sacred Apis bull. By participating in these ancient rituals, Alexander was signaling his intent to govern as a legitimate successor to the line of Ramses and Thutmose, a move that stabilized the province far more effectively than any garrison could have. Mazus, the Persian satrap who held the authority in Memphis, surrendered the treasury and the provincial administration without a single gesture of defiance. He recognized that the momentum of the Macedonian advance was irresistible. The gold within the Egyptian vaults provided the expedition with a renewed financial foundation, while the grain of the Nile Valley offered a guarantee of sustenance for the years of interior campaigning that lay ahead. Alexander moved through the halls of the palace not as an intruder, but as a figure who had been anticipated by the long memory of the Egyptian record. He spent his initial weeks in Memphis reorganizing the taxation and judicial systems, ensuring that the local laws remained in place while the overarching military control was transferred to Macedonian hands. Standing upon the narrow strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean, the king envisioned a city that would serve as a bridge between the Hellenic world and the ancient wealth of Africa. This site, located near the village of Rakotis, possessed a natural harbor protected by the island of Pharos and was cooled by the constant sea breezes that swept in from the north. Alexander walked the perimeter of the future city with his architects, including the celebrated Dinocrates of Rhodes, tracing the lines of the walls and the placement of the central agora. It was a moment of pure conceptual creation, where the geography of the coast was being reimagined as a global center of commerce and scholarship. Flour served as the temporary medium for marking the boundaries of the new settlement, as the surveying teams lacked the customary chalk necessary to delineate the vast scale of the city. The king himself assisted in scattering the white meal across the dark soil, outlining the paths of the broad avenues and the foundations of the royal district. As the workers moved across the site, clouds of birds descended from the sky to feast upon the flour, an event that initially caused concern among the surveyors who viewed it as a potential ill omen. The seer Aristotle, however, interpreted the event as a sign that the city of Alexandria would one day provide nourishment for the entire world. Architects and surveyors were left behind to oversee the construction of the moles and the leveling of the ground, while the king prepared for a journey that was as much a spiritual quest as a strategic exploration. He turned his attention toward the Siwa oasis, located deep within the Libyan desert, where the oracle of Ammon, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus, resided in a temple of immense antiquity. This trek required the army to move away from the safety of the Nile into a landscape of shifting dunes and extreme temperatures, where the horizon was a constant, shimmering heat mirage. The motivation for this detour was deeply personal for Alexander, driven by a desire to confirm the nature of his own parentage that his mother, Olympias, had so often hinted at in Pella. Beneath the weight of the desert sun, the march became a test of physical endurance and navigational skill, as the sand frequently erased the paths and the water sources were few and far between. The air was dry and still, carrying only the fine, abrasive dust that settled into the folds of the soldiers' tunics and the gaps in their armor. According to the accounts of the time, the expedition was saved from a catastrophic sandstorm by the sudden appearance of 2 ravens, or perhaps 2 serpents, that led the king's party toward the oasis when the guides had lost their way. Whether through divine intervention or the keen observation of local wildlife, the column eventually reached the lush, green canopy of the Siwa oasis. Westward, the path toward the temple of Amun was lined with palm groves and olive trees, providing a cooling shade that felt like a physical embrace after the glare of the dunes. The oasis possessed a unique microclimate, fueled by subterranean springs that had sustained a community of priests and pilgrims for thousands of years. Alexander approached the sanctuary alone, leaving his guards and his companions at the threshold of the inner court to maintain the sanctity of the ritual. The temple was a structure of weathered limestone, its walls covered in hieroglyphs that whispered of a history far older than the Macedonian kingdom, and the scent of frankincense lingered in the still air of the portico. Legend spoke of the oracle's accuracy and its ability to pierce the veil of the future, a reputation that had drawn visitors from across the Mediterranean for generations. As the king entered the dim coolness of the Adyton, the most sacred inner chamber, he was met by the chief priest of Ammon, who addressed him with a formal greeting that would change the course of the king's life. The priest, perhaps struggling with the nuances of the Greek language, or perhaps speaking with a deliberate prophetic intent, welcomed Alexander as the Son of God. This salutation was accepted by the king, not as a polite metaphor, but as a literal confirmation of his celestial origin and his unique place in the cosmic order. Relief arrived in the form of this divine endorsement, as Alexander emerged from the temple with a quiet, focused intensity that his companions noted with a degree of unease. He reportedly asked the oracle whether all of his father's murderers had been punished, and whether he was destined to become the Lord of all mankind, receiving answers that satisfied his internal requirements. The encounter at Siwa functioned as a psychological pivot for the king, after which he increasingly integrated the iconography of Zeus Amun into his royal identity. The horns of the ram, the symbol of the Egyptian god, began to appear on his coinage and his portraits, signaling a shift from a Macedonian hegemon to a universal sovereign. Inside the sanctuary's shadow, the transition of the king's identity was finalized, but the administrative needs of the empire remained pressing. The return journey to the Nile was conducted with a swifter pace, as the army moved back toward Memphis to finalize the governance of the province before the next phase of the Persian War. Alexander appointed separate governors for the civil and military administrations of Egypt, a policy of divided power intended to prevent any single official from staging a revolt in the wealthy and isolated territory. He also commissioned the construction of more temples and the restoration of older shrines, ensuring that the religious life of the Nile remained vibrant and autonomous under his rule. Greeting the king upon his return, the Greek cities sent embassies to offer crowns of gold and to celebrate his coronation as pharaoh. The ceremonial life of Egypt reached a height of activity as Alexander was officially invested with the skent, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, in the Temple of Ptah. This was the same crown that had been worn by the god-kings of the past, representing the unification of the valley and the delta under a single divine authority. The Macedonian prince stood as the living embodiment of the Nile's continuity, a figure who had successfully bridged the gap between the philosophy of the Greeks and the theology of the Egyptians. Acceptance of this title provided Alexander with a degree of stability that few foreign rulers had ever achieved in Egypt. He had secured the southwestern flank of his empire and established a port that would eventually facilitate the flow of wealth and ideas for centuries to come. However, the chronicle of the great King Darius was not yet finished, and the news from the east suggested that the Persian monarch was gathering an even larger force in the heart of Mesopotamia. The time for the quietude of the Nile was ending, and the call of the dusty plains beyond the Euphrates began to resonate once more through the Macedonian camp. Departing the oasis and the temples, the army moved northward toward the Levant, retracing their steps through the coastal cities they had captured the year before. The soldiers carried with them the memory of the cooling Nile and the mystery of the desert oracle, but their focus was now sharpened by the prospect of a final, decisive encounter. Alexander rode at the head of the column, his iron helmet polished to a mirror-like shine and his mind already engaged in the tactical problems of a vast open-field engagement. The shadow of Gaugamela was beginning to lengthen across the landscape, a place where the fate of two empires would be decided in a single day of heat and iron. Ceremonial life in Egypt would continue in his absence, as the foundations of Alexandria rose from the dark soil and the priests continued their prayers for the new pharaoh. The king, however, was already crossing the Euphrates, moving into a territory where the geography was as vast as his ambitions. The transition from the liberated world of the West to the imperial heartland of the East was about to begin, and the sound of the sarissa pikes against the shields was the only music that mattered. Having secured the grain and the gods of the south, the king now looked toward the rising sun. The river of the Nile was behind him, and the river of history lay ahead, winding through the plains of Assyria toward a destiny that even the ravens of Siwa could not have fully foreseen. Chapter 8: Gaugamela and the Scythed Chariots. Darius III waited in the heart of Assyria with a persistence that signaled the final, concentrated effort of the Achaemenid world to preserve its own existence. Since his retreat from the narrow plains of Issus, the great king had utilized the vast administrative reach of his empire to gather a force that dwarfed his previous assemblies. He drew men from the furthest reaches of Bactria, Scythia, and the Indus Valley. He chose the location for this final encounter with a specific, strategic clarity, selecting the broad, flat plains of Gaugamela near the ruins of ancient Nineveh. Unlike the confined geography of the coast, this terrain was meticulously prepared. Persian laborers had spent weeks leveling the ground, removing rocks and smoothing ridges to ensure that their superior numbers and heavy cavalry could operate without obstruction. The crossing of the Tigris River in September 331 BCE was a maneuver of significant physical difficulty. as the water was swifter and deeper than that of the Euphrates. Macedonian engineers utilized a series of tethered boats and guide ropes to assist the infantry, who struggled against the current while holding their weapons and armor above the splashing spray. As the army reached the eastern bank, they observed a lunar eclipse, a celestial event that initially caused a ripple of unease among the superstitious ranks of the phalanx. Alexander, however, redirected this anxiety with the help of his Egyptian and Greek seers, framing the darkening of the moon as a sign of the fading Persian power and the rising of the sun-like Macedonian star. The landscape of Gaugamela was defined by its immense scale, a beige infinity of dust and dry grass that seemed to swallow the horizon in every direction. As the Macedonian vanguard crested a low range of hills and looked down upon the Persian camp, they saw a sea of lights from tens of thousands of fires, stretching further than the eye could comfortably measure. The air was dry and carried the scent of the leveled earth, a dusty, mineral smell that settled into the lungs of the men as they prepared their own positions. This was not a space for the subtle traps of a mountain pass, but a stage for the sheer, grinding application of mass and momentum. In the quiet of the night before the engagement, Parmenion arrived at the king's tent to suggest a nocturnal assault. He argued that the darkness would neutralize the Persian advantage of numbers and spread panic through their disparate ranks. Alexander rejected the suggestion with a quiet finality, stating that he would not steal a victory like a thief in the night, but would win it in the full clarity of the day. This decision was driven by a desire for a definitive conclusion. A night battle might lead to a scattered retreat, but a daylight victory would break the authority of the great king in the eyes of all his subjects. He then dismissed his generals and retired to his bed, leaving the camp to the low, steady murmur of the night watch. Alexander slept with a heavy, unburdened calmness that his companions found remarkable given the scale of the force arrayed against them the next morning. When Parmenion entered the royal tent at dawn to wake him, he found the king in a deep rest, appearing more like a man who had already secured his prize than one on the threshold of a catastrophe. The king rose quietly and dressed in the armor he had worn at Issus, adding a refined iron helmet that had been polished until it glowed like silver in the early light. This composure served as a psychological anchor for the senior officers, radiating a sense of inevitability that was more effective than any prepared oration. Between the two armies lay the leveled plain, where Darius had positioned his most specialized weapons, the scythed chariots. These heavy wooden vehicles featured sharpened bronze blades extending from the wheel hubs and the yokes, designed to drive through the infantry phalanx and shear through the legs and spears of the soldiers. The sound of these chariots moving into position, the rhythmic rattling of the chains, and the heavy breathing of the four-horse teams was a persistent, mechanical undertone to the morning's preparations. The great king stood in his high chariot at the center of his line, surrounded by the immortal guard and a dense thicket of Persian infantry, his golden parasol a solitary dot of color in the sea of iron. A single, crystallizing moment of tactical ingenuity occurred as the Persian chariots were unleashed across the smooth ground toward the Macedonian center. As the vehicles reached their maximum speed, their blades humming with a low metallic vibration, the Macedonian phalanx did not attempt to brace against the impact with a wall of shields. Instead, upon a prearranged signal from the king, the ranks simply parted, creating narrow corridors or mousetraps through which the chariots passed harmlessly. The soldiers then struck the sides of the horses and the drivers with their javelins as they moved through the gaps, neutralizing the terrifying weapon with a quiet, choreographed efficiency that left the Persian momentum shattered. Following the failure of the chariots, the engagement shifted into a dense, pushing struggle of massed cavalry on the Macedonian right. Alexander led the companion cavalry in a wide, oblique movement, drawing the Persian left away from their center and creating a widening gap in the imperial line. He watched for the precise moment when the Persian center was thinned, then wheeled his riders into a giant wedge and dove directly toward the position of Darius. The sound of this charge was a dull, rhythmic thudding of thousands of hooves on the dry soil, rising into a roar as the Macedonian pikes met the Persian royal guard. In this sudden, violent compression of space, the great king once again found himself within sight of the Macedonian prince, whose spear was leveled at the imperial chariot. The air was thick with a fine, blinding dust that coated the horses and the men, turning the sunlight into a hazy orange glow. Seeing his guard beginning to buckle and the Macedonian wedge driving into the heart of his formation, Darius turned his chariot and fled from the field for the second time. The flight of the sovereign acted as a signal for the general collapse of the Persian army. As the central command vanished, the vast host began to disintegrate into a fragmented, retreating mass. Outcome and consequence arrived with a heavy, settling finality as the dust of the pursuit began to clear in the late afternoon. While Alexander had been forced to halt his chase of Darius to assist Parmenion on the struggling left wing, the victory was nonetheless absolute. The great king had escaped toward the eastern mountains, but his authority over the heart of the empire had been permanently severed at Gaugamela. The Macedonian army, though weary and covered in the grey Assyrian dust, now stood as the master of Mesopotamia, with the road to the ancient capitals of the world lying open before them. Administrative oversight for the thousands of wounded and the processing of the immense spoils began immediately in the shadow of the battlefield. The king moved through the makeshift tents, noting the durability of the sarissa pikes and the effectiveness of the new armor designs that had been tested in the heat of the struggle. He also oversaw the burial of the fallen, ensuring that the funeral rites were conducted with a formal dignity that respected the sacrifice of the veterans. The victory was a triumph of the Macedonian military machine, a confirmation that the professionalized structure inherited from Philip could overcome any degree of numerical disparity. Babylon, the most ancient and storied city of the Mesopotamian plains, sat only a few days' march to the south, its hanging gardens and great walls a prize of unimaginable prestige. As the army moved toward the city, they were met not with resistance, but with a procession of priests and officials who carried gifts of gold and frankincense. Mazaeus, the Persian governor who had fought with distinction at Gaugamela, surrendered the city to avoid a destructive siege, recognizing that the new order had already arrived. The transition from the dust of the Assyrian plain to the paved avenues of Babylon was a shift into a world of immense, settled luxury. Accepting the surrender of the city, the king entered the Ishtar Gate amidst a rain of flower petals and the chanting of the Babylonian populace. He proceeded immediately to the temple of Bel-Marduk, the patron deity of the city, and ordered its reconstruction, demonstrating the same religious sensitivity he had shown in Egypt. This gesture secured the loyalty of the Babylonian priesthood and signaled that the Macedonian rule would be one of restoration rather than mere occupation. The gold in the Babylonian treasury was so vast that it required hundreds of pack animals to move, providing the king with the means to pay his army for years to come. The journey toward the Persian heartland was now the primary focus of the Macedonian court, as the treasures of Susa and Persepolis waited beyond the Zagros mountains. While the great King Darius remained a fugitive in the east, the administrative and symbolic center of the empire was now firmly in Alexander's hands. The army settled into the cooling gardens of Babylon for a period of rest, their minds already adjusting to the scale of the continent they were slowly absorbing. Ahead lay the high palaces of the Persian kings, where the fires of the past were still burning in the cold mountain air. Chapter 9. The Fire in the Stone. The gold and silver bullion stored within the vaults of Susa was not merely a collection of wealth, but a geological accumulation of 2 centuries of imperial taxation. When the Macedonian army arrived at the gates of this ancient Elamite capital in late 331 BCE, they found a city that served as the winter heart of the empire. The treasury here yielded a staggering 50,000 talents of silver, a sum so vast that it effectively shifted the economic center of the Mediterranean world eastward in a single afternoon. Within the palace storerooms, the Macedonians discovered 5,000 talents weight of purple cloth from Tyre, which had been preserved in the darkness for nearly 200 years. The fabric, treated with the rare extract of the murex snail, still retained its vibrant deep hue and a faint sharp scent of the sea. It was a testament to the enduring quality of Persian administrative preservation. Movement toward the Persian heartland required the army to leave the humid river valleys and ascend into the jagged, snow-dusted heights of the Zagros Mountains. This was a landscape of vertical granite and narrow, wind-scoured passes, where the temperature dropped sharply as the sun dipped behind the western ridges. The transition from the luxury of the Susa Palace to the abrasive reality of mountain warfare was a physical strain on the veterans, who now walked with their cloaks wrapped tightly against the thinning air. As the column moved higher, the sound of the march changed, the soft thud of dust replaced by the rhythmic crunch of gravel and the occasional, distant echo of a stone falling into a deep ravine. Inside the narrow defile known as the Persian Gates, the satrap Ariobarzanes had constructed a wall of stone to block the Macedonian advance, defended by a concentrated force of 40,000 Persian troops. This was the final, desperate threshold of the Achaemenid world, a place where the geography favored the defender with a brutal, uncompromising clarity. When Alexander first attempted to force the pass, his troops were met with a rain of boulders and javelins from the heights, forcing a rare and humiliating retreat that left the king in a state of uncharacteristic frustration. The air in the camp that night was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the quiet, urgent murmurs of the scouts, as the expedition realized that the road to Persepolis was being guarded by the very bones of the earth. A local shepherd whose knowledge of the mountain paths was born of generations of seasonal migration provided the king with the means to bypass the Persian wall. Alexander led a select force of light infantry and cavalry along this path in the middle of a freezing night, moving through chest-deep snow and over icy ledges where a single misstep meant a silent descent into the dark. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the heavy, labored breathing of the men as they struggled for purchase on the slick stone. By dawn, they had emerged behind the Persian lines, delivering a sudden, devastating blow that mirrored the hammer and anvil tactics used on the plains, but executed here amidst the clouds and the ice. Following the collapse of the defense at the Persian gates, the way to Persepolis lay open, a descent from the heights toward the high, fertile plain of Marv-Dasht. This city was the symbolic and spiritual center of the Persian world, founded by Darius the Great to serve as a ceremonial stage for the display of imperial majesty. As the army approached the city in early 330 BCE, they were met by a sight that halted the march in a collective, horrified silence. A group of 800 Greek captives, most of them elderly men who had been taken years earlier, emerged from the city to meet the king. Their bodies had been systematically mutilated by their Persian masters. Named and recorded by the chroniclers, these men had been deprived of their hands, feet, or ears, and many were branded with Persian characters to signify their status as imperial property. The sight of these survivors, standing in the cold light of the plateau with their missing limbs and scarred faces, provided a visceral, human weight to the abstract concept of the Persian enemy. Alexander was said to have been moved to tears, offering the men enough gold and land to return to their homes in Greece and live in comfort. After a period of quiet deliberation, however, the captives requested to stay together in Persia, fearing that their families in the West would not recognize them or would be repulsed by their physical condition. The king granted their request, providing them with livestock and grain. This encounter served to sharpen the resolve of the Macedonian troops as they entered the royal city. Persepolis itself was a marvel of stone and cedar, its great terrace rising 60 feet above the plain and supporting a forest of 60-foot limestone columns. The walls were covered in intricate bas-reliefs depicting delegations from every corner of the empire bringing tribute, vessels of gold, exotic animals, and rolls of fine silk. This was the national soul of Persia, a place of immense ancestral weight where the Achaemenid kings were entombed in the cliffs of Naxch-Rostam. The Macedonian soldiers moved through the Apadana, the great audience hall, their iron-shod boots clattering on the polished stone floors that had once been the exclusive domain of the great king's inner circle. Administrative processing of the Persepolis treasury exceeded anything the expedition had yet encountered, yielding a staggering 120,000 talents of gold and silver. The volume of wealth was so immense that it required 10,000 pairs of mules and 5,000 camels to transport the bullion away from the city toward the safety of Susa. This was the final, total liquidation of the Persian state, a transfer of material power that left the Achaemenid bureaucracy without the means to function or to hire new mercenary armies. Alexander took up residence in the royal palace, sitting upon the golden throne of Darius, though his feet reportedly did not reach the floor, requiring a small table to be used as a footstool. Interpretive asides from the historians of the march suggest that the atmosphere in Persepolis was one of mounting tension. The king struggled with the symbolic requirements of his victory. While he had acted as a restorer of order in Babylon and a pharaoh in Egypt, Persepolis was the site of the original planning for the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier. The memory of the burning of the Acropolis in Athens remained a persistent cultural wound for the Greeks in his service, a grievance that the presence of the mutilated captives had only served to inflame. For 4 months, the army remained in the city, the cold mountain spring slowly turning toward the heat of summer, while the king pondered the final fate of the palace. A grand symposium was held in the royal quarters toward the end of their stay, a night of heavy drinking and celebratory rhetoric that would lead to one of the most debated events of the campaign. During the festivities, a woman named Thais, an Athenian companion of Ptolemy, delivered an oration. She suggested that the greatest service Alexander could perform for Greece would be to burn the palace of Xerxes as a symbolic retribution for the past. The suggestion was met with a sudden, drunken enthusiasm by the gathered officers, who saw in the act a way to signal the definitive end of the Persian era. The king, caught in the momentum of the moment, and perhaps seeking to fulfill a perceived historical obligation, rose from his couch and seized a torch from a wall bracket. The sound of the fire began as a low, persistent crackle in the cedar-beamed ceilings of the royal apartments, quickly rising into a roar as the dry wood and the heavy tapestries provided a surplus of fuel. Alexander led a procession of his companions and musicians through the palace, throwing their torches into the halls as they moved. The light of the flames reflected off the polished limestone and the gold-leafed reliefs. Within an hour, the great terrace was crowned with a pillar of smoke and fire that could be seen for miles across the Mavdash plain. It was a signal to the entire Persian world that the House of Cyrus had reached its final rest. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that the fire was concentrated in the most symbolic areas of the palace, particularly the quarters of Xerxes, while other administrative sections showed less signs of heat damage. This supports the idea that the burning was a calculated, symbolic act rather than a chaotic accident, intended to demonstrate that the Achaemenid dynasty was now a matter of historical record rather than a living authority. As the roofs collapsed and the great columns were scarred by the heat, the administrative heart of the empire was rendered silent, its records of taxation and tribute buried under the settling ash. When the sun rose the following morning, the king is said to have regretted the destruction, ordering the fires extinguished and the remaining structures secured. The gesture of retribution had been made, but it left him as the master of a blackened ruin rather than a functional capital. The charred ruins of Persepolis remained as a monument to a specific moment of cultural catharsis, but they also marked the point where the campaign began to move away from its original pan-Hellenic mission. Alexander was no longer merely a Greek avenger. He was a sovereign who had destroyed his own capital to prove a point to a world that was already falling behind him. Across the eastern horizon, the hunt for Darius the Free remained the only unfinished piece of the imperial puzzle. The great king had fled toward Ecbatana with a small remnant of his guard, hoping to find refuge in the rugged terrain of Media and Parthia. The Macedonian army, having spent the wealth of Persepolis and witnessed the fire in the stone, prepared to resume the march into the vast, dry interior of the continent. The transition was one of increasing isolation, as they moved further from the sea and deeper into a world where the laws of the highlands were the only ones that remained. Chapter 10. The Dust of the Caspian Gates. The high plateau of Media, reaching toward the cooling heights of Ecbatana, served as the final sanctuary for the remnants of the Achaemenid court during the summer of 330 BCE. This landscape was characterized by its vast, open vistas and the sharp, clean scent of mountain thyme that clung to the rocky outcrops. Darius III had settled here with a gathered force of some 30,000 infantry and several thousand Greek mercenaries, hoping to rebuild his authority within the rugged interior of the east. The city of Ecbatana, with its 7 concentric walls, each painted a different symbolic color, remained a place of immense ancestral dignity. Yet the atmosphere within its gates was one of profound, lingering uncertainty. Darius remained a figure of quiet persistence, though his status as a sovereign was increasingly eroded by the reality of his repeated retreats. He waited for reinforcements from the eastern satrapies that never arrived in the numbers required, while his own senior officers began to question the efficacy of his leadership. The great king occupied the summer palace, surrounded by the same golden vessels and silken hangings that had followed him across Asia. But the administrative machinery of his empire was now a fragmented and local affair. The sun rose and set over the Median hills, marking the days of a reign that was rapidly contracting toward its final, isolated movement. As the heat of the summer deepened, Alexander began his pursuit from Persepolis with a focused, relentless momentum that disregarded the traditional boundaries of seasonal campaigning. He left a significant portion of his army and the vast treasure of the empire in the care of Parmenion at Ecbatana, choosing to lead a smaller, highly mobile force of cavalry and light infantry into the eastern deserts. The king recognized that as long as Darius remained alive and at large, the legitimacy of his own claim to the Persian throne would be subject to challenge. The march was conducted with a speed that left the Macedonian baggage train miles behind, as the soldiers carried only their weapons and the barest of rations. Moving north from the Median capital, the column crossed into the territory of the Parthians, where the air became drier and the vegetation sparser. The sound of the pursuit was a rhythmic, tiring cadence of hooves on sun-baked clay, a sound that persisted through the long hours of the morning and the cooling shadows of the dusk. Alexander frequently rode at the head of the scouts, pressing the pace until the horses were lathered with salt and the men were coated in a fine grey dust that made their faces appear as weathered as the landscape. It was a period of extreme physical strain, where the survival of the great king depended on the distance he could maintain between himself and the Macedonian vanguard. Within the walls of the Persian camp, however, a more intimate and dangerous struggle was unfolding among the satraps who accompanied the king. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria and a kinsman of Darius, began to maneuver for control of the retreating column, believing that the great king's habit of flight had forfeited his right to lead. He was joined in this conspiracy by Nabarazanes, the commander of the royal guard, and Barcientes, the satrap of Arachosia. These men viewed the capture of Darius not as an act of treason, but as a strategic necessity that would allow them to negotiate with Alexander or to continue the resistance under a more aggressive commander. But the news of the Macedonian approach forced the conspirators to act with a sudden, desperate finality. They placed the great king in golden chains and confined him to a common covered wagon, a humiliating reversal of the majesty he had occupied only months before. The royal pavilion was struck, and the column began a frantic flight toward the eastern provinces of Bactria and Sogdia. The sight of the great king being carried like a prisoner in his own baggage train was reported to Alexander by Persian deserters, an account that spurred the Macedonian king to even greater heights of urgency. 11 days of nearly continuous riding followed, as Alexander took 500 of his best cavalry and pushed them through the night toward the Caspian gates. This narrow pass was a natural bottleneck, where the mountains of the Alborz range dipped toward the salt deserts of the interior, a place where the wind carried a sharp, saline bite. Many of the Macedonian horses collapsed from exhaustion along the route, their riders continuing on foot or mounting the animals of those who had fallen behind. The king remained at the front, driven by a desire to reach Darius before the conspirators could execute their final plan. The Caspian gates were reached at dawn, the limestone cliffs glowing with a pale, orange light as the first Macedonian scouts filtered through the pass. They found the area abandoned, save for the cooling embers of Persian campfires and the discarded debris of a hurried retreat. The terrain beyond the gates opened into a vast, shimmering plain where the heat haze made it difficult to distinguish between the horizon and the dust of the road. Alexander pressed on, his eyes fixed on the distant plumes of dust that signaled the position of the Persian rear guard. The conspiracy of the satraps reached its violent conclusion near the site of Hekatompilos, the city of 100 gates. As the Macedonian cavalry finally closed within sight of the Persian column, Basus and his associates urged Darius to mount a horse and flee with them into the Bactrian highlands. When the great king refused, choosing instead to wait for the arrival of his rival, the conspirators struck him down with their javelins and left him bleeding in the back of the wagon. They then fled into the desert with their own followers, leaving the dying monarch alone in the silence of the high road. Bessus argued that the death of the king was the only way to prevent Alexander from claiming the Argead Achaemenid succession through a peaceful handover. By leaving a corpse instead of a captive, they hoped to force a continuation of the war on their own terms in the rugged eastern provinces. The administrative logic of the conspiracy was sound, even if the act itself was one of profound personal betrayal. The great king, who had once commanded the movements of millions, was now a solitary, wounded figure in a dusty wagon, his breathing slowing as the sound of the Macedonian hooves drew closer. Alexander arrived at the wagon shortly after the final breath had left the king, finding the body attended only by a few loyal servants and the soldier Polystratus, who had discovered the cart while searching for water. The king dismounted and stood in the presence of his fallen rival, observing the stillness of the man who had occupied his thoughts and his strategies for over 5 years. History records that Alexander was moved by a sense of tragedy rather than triumph, removing his own royal cloak and spreading it over the body of Darius to shield it from the dust and the sun. It was a gesture of profound symbolic continuity, signaling that the war against the great king was over and the war against the regicides had begun. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the dry heat of the afternoon as the Macedonian officers gathered around the wagon. They observed the golden chains that still bound the king's wrists, a physical detail that underscored the indignity of his end. For Alexander, the death of Darius presented a new administrative challenge. He must now position himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the avenger of the legitimate Persian monarch. He ordered that the body be embalmed and sent back to Persepolis, to be buried with full royal honors in the tombs of his ancestors at Rostam. Near the site of Hekatompilos, a single soldier named Polystratus is preserved in the record for a small, human-scale act of mercy. He had been the first to find the wagon and, hearing the faint moans of the king, had brought him a draught of water in his helmet. Darius had reportedly thanked him, expressing a final wish that Alexander would reward those who had remained loyal and punish those who had betrayed their oaths. This miniature story, reported to Alexander upon his arrival, provided the king with the moral framework he needed to justify his upcoming campaigns in the east. The thirsty king and the soldier with the helmet became a crystallizing image of the transition from the old world to the new. The tragedy of the great king was that he had been a man of moderate virtues cast into an era that demanded the extraordinary. Darius was described by the chroniclers as a man of personal bravery and administrative competence, but one who lacked the tactical flexibility to counter the Macedonian machine. His death marked the definitive end of the Achaemenid era that had begun with Cyrus the Great 2 centuries earlier. The empire was no longer a state with a center. It was a vast, ungoverned landscape where individual satraps now fought for their own survival. The pursuit of Bessus became the primary focus of the Macedonian court, as the Bactrian satrap had officially assumed the royal tiara and the name Artaxerxes V. This move was viewed by Alexander as a direct affront to his own authority and a violation of the laws of kingship. The army, though exhausted by the long chase through the desert, was reorganized for a campaign into the furthest reaches of the east, into the mountains of the Hindu Kush and the steppes of Central Asia. The chronicle was shifting from the capture of cities to the hunting of men through a landscape that was increasingly alien and hostile. No longer a war for a throne, the conflict was now a quest for the total consolidation of a continent. Alexander turned his gaze toward the northeast, toward the rising dust of the Bactrian road. Behind him, the body of Darius was being carried toward the limestone cliffs of the Persian heartland, a journey that closed the book on the old empire. Ahead lay the high, cold plateaus where the air was thin and the rules of the highlands were the only ones that remained. Chapter 11. The Sogdian Rock and the White Scarf. The disappearance of a central Persian authority following the death of Darius did not bring the expected conclusion to the war, but instead triggered a fragmentation of the conflict into a series of localized and bitter insurgencies. Alexander found himself no longer pursuing a single imperial army, but struggling against a shifting landscape of tribal loyalties and regional satraps who viewed the Macedonian presence as a foreign intrusion into their ancient ways of life. This new phase of the campaign required the army to move into the furthest reaches of the northeast, toward the provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana, where the geography was defined by the towering peaks of the Hindu Kush. The transition was one of increasing isolation as the expedition pushed beyond the maps of the classical Greek world and into a territory that felt like the very edge of the inhabited earth. Crossing the Great Barrier of the Parapamisadi, known today as the Hindu Kush, occupied the spring of 329 BCE and tested the endurance of the veterans to their absolute limit. The army struggled through narrow, wind-swept passes where the snow remained deep even in the late season, and the air was so thin that every step required a conscious, labored effort of the will. The sound of the march was muffled by the drifts, a quiet, rhythmic crunching of thousands of boots that persisted through the freezing mists of the high altitudes. This was a world of vertical granite and blinding white light, where the familiar landmarks of the Mediterranean seemed like the memories of a different life. Provisions became so scarce during the high crossing that the soldiers were forced to slaughter their own pack animals, eating the raw meat of mules and horses to maintain their strength in the absence of firewood. They discovered a local plant, silphium, which the horses consumed with a desperate hunger. its pungent scent clinging to the breath of the animals in the cold air. The king moved among the ranks on foot, sharing the same meager rations as his infantry and refusing any comfort that was not available to the common soldier. This shared hardship served to maintain the cohesion of the machine, even as the distance from home grew to a scale that few could truly comprehend. Behind the retreating Bessus, who had now styled himself Artaxerxes V, lay a scorched earth policy intended to starve the Macedonian advance before it could reach the fertile Oxus Valley. Every village along the route was burned and every granary emptied, leaving a trail of grey ash and silence in the wake of the regicides' flight. The administrative response of the Macedonian command was to maintain a relentless tempo, refusing to allow the enemy time to settle or to consolidate his defenses. The pursuit remained the singular focus of the court, a hunt for the man who had claimed a crown he had not earned through battle. A small village in Bactria became the site of the final, ignominious capture of Bessus, who was eventually betrayed by his own associates in a mirror of the betrayal he had visited upon Darius. Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, was sent ahead with a small detachment to secure the captive, finding him standing alone in a courtyard, stripped of his royal finery and his dignity. The regicide was bound and placed in a wooden collar, then led to the side of the road where Alexander's column would pass. When the king arrived, he did not offer the formal respect he had shown to the fallen Darius. Instead, he ordered that Bessus be scourged and then sent to Ecbatana to face execution. Bessus was sentenced to the traditional Persian punishment for treason, the amputation of his nose and ears before a public death. Interpretive asides from the chroniclers suggest that this moment marked a shift in Alexander's administrative style, as he began to adopt the more brutal and symbolic justice of the Persian kings he had replaced. To the Macedonian officers, these punishments appeared alien and unnecessarily cruel. Yet, to the Persian subjects, they were the necessary actions of a legitimate sovereign. The king was increasingly balancing the expectations of two different worlds, a task that created a growing friction within his own inner circle. Resistance in Sogdiana proved to be more resilient than the formal opposition of the satraps, led by a local nobleman named Spitomenes, who utilized the mobility of the steppe cavalry to harass the Macedonian lines. This was a war of shadows and sudden ambushes, where the phalanx was often useless against the hit-and-run tactics of the desert tribes. The army was forced to establish a series of fortified outposts to protect their supply lines, a process that tied down thousands of troops in a landscape that seemed to swallow them whole. It was during this period of frustration that the king turned his attention toward the Sogdian Rock, a limestone fortress that was believed to be impregnable. The rock was a sheer-walled bastion that rose abruptly from the plain, its summit crowned with a citadel that was stocked with enough grain and water to withstand a siege of several years. When Alexander summoned the defenders to surrender, the Sogdian leader Oxyates replied with a taunt, telling the king that he would need to find soldiers with wings if he hoped to reach the top. The fortress was surrounded by deep snow and ice-covered cliffs, offering no obvious point of ascent for a traditional siege engine or a scaling ladder. In the silence of the camp that evening, the king considered the challenge, recognizing that the capture of the rock was essential to breaking the morale of the regional revolt. 300 volunteers from among the most experienced climbers in the army were gathered at dusk, each man provided with a set of iron tent pegs to serve as pitons and lengths of strong flaxen rope. The king offered immense rewards for the first men to reach the summit, a gesture that spurred the soldiers to attempt an ascent that seemed to defy the limits of human capability. Under the cover of a moonless night, the climbers began their silent vertical journey, driving the iron pegs into the frozen crevices of the rock and pulling themselves upward through the freezing dark. The sound of the mountain was limited to the low, rhythmic clinking of metal on stone and the occasional heavy thud of a man losing his footing and falling silently into the void. History records that 30 men perished during the night, their bodies disappearing into the snow at the base of the cliff without a sound. The remaining 270 persisted, their fingers numbed by the ice and their breathing shallow in the thin mountain air. By the first light of dawn, they reached the summit and stood above the sleeping citadel, looking down upon the defenders who believed themselves to be utterly secure. Upon a signal from the king below, the winged soldiers unfurled long strips of white linen and waved them against the morning sky, signaling their presence to the army and the fortress alike. The surrender of the rock followed almost immediately, as the defenders were stunned by the sight of the Macedonians standing upon the supposedly unreachable heights. Oxyates, seeing that the king had indeed found soldiers with wings, opened the gates and submitted to the Macedonian authority. Among the captives taken in the citadel was Roxana, the daughter of Oxyates, a woman whose beauty was said by the chroniclers to be surpassed only by that of Statira, the wife of Darius. In a move that was both a matter of personal attraction and high administrative strategy, Alexander decided to take her as his wife. A traditional Macedonian wedding ceremony was conducted on the high plateau, featuring the ritual cutting of a loaf of bread with a sword, which the bride and groom then shared. This union was a profound symbolic bridge, tying the Argead house to the local nobility of the northeast and providing stability to a province that had known only war. It was a moment of quiet domesticity amidst the dust of the campaign, a festive occasion where the wine of Sogdiana flowed and the sound of the flutes echoed through the limestone halls. By marrying Roxana, Alexander was signaling that he intended to stay, that the East was no longer a place of transit, but a place of habitation. Material details of the period focus on the shifting aesthetics of the court, as the king began to wear a mix of Macedonian and Persian attire and encouraged his officers to do the same. He adopted the white diadem and the purple tunic of the Achaemenids, though he stopped short of wearing the full, elaborate regalia of the great king. This cultural synthesis was met with a growing, silent resentment among the veterans, who felt that their leader was being seduced by the luxuries of the people they had defeated. The air in the camp was often thick with the scent of unfamiliar spices and the smoke of Eastern incense, a sensory reminder of the distance they had traveled from the rugged hills of Pella. The consolidation of the northeast was finalized with the death of Spitamenes, who was eventually killed by his own allies and his head sent to Alexander as a peace offering. With the Sogdian revolt broken and the border with the northern nomads secured by the foundation of Alexandria Eschate, the king turned his gaze toward the south. The mountain passes of the Hindu Kush were behind him once more, and the rumors of a land of great rivers and immense wealth began to circulate through the ranks. The turn toward India was no longer a theoretical plan, but a physical movement of the machine toward the rising sun. The journey into the Indus Valley was the final, grand ambition of a man who had already absorbed the core of the known world. As the army prepared their gear and the horses were shod for the river crossings, the atmosphere was one of quiet, weary determination. They had climbed the highest rocks and captured the furthest cities, but the river of the world's edge was still waiting to be found. Chapter 12. The Shadow in the Tent. Callisthenes of Olynthus, a kinsman of Aristotle and the official chronicler of the campaign, occupied a position in the royal court that was increasingly defined by a quiet, intellectual friction. He had traveled from the academy to the edge of the world to record the deeds of a Macedonian king, but in the cities of Bactra and Maracanda, he found himself observing the emergence of an Eastern autocrat. The philosopher remained a figure of stubborn Hellenic tradition, wearing the simple woolen cloak of a scholar amidst a court that was beginning to shimmer with silk and gold. It was through his eyes that the growing distance between the king and his veteran officers was most clearly documented. The administrative requirements of a universal empire began to collide with the egalitarian traditions of the Macedonian highlands. Within the high-walled palaces of the northeast, Alexander introduced the practice of proskynesis, the traditional Persian act of bowing or prostrating oneself before the sovereign. To the Persians, this was a necessary gesture of social and religious hierarchy, a recognition of the king's role as the earthly representative of the divine. For the Macedonians, however, such an act was reserved exclusively for the gods. The requirement to perform it before a mortal man was viewed as an intolerable indignity. The air in the reception halls grew heavy with a new kind of silence. This ritual requirement was not merely a matter of personal vanity, but a calculated attempt by Alexander to unify his court under a single imperial protocol. He recognized that he could not rule a Persian majority while maintaining the informal, boisterous accessibility of a Macedonian warlord. By adopting proskynesis, he sought to bridge the cultural gap between his subjects, yet the move only served to isolate him from the men who had carried him from the Hellespont. The king sat upon a throne that was now physically and symbolically elevated, a distance that the dust of the road had once served to erase. During a formal banquet in 327 BCE, a deliberate experiment was conducted to test the court's willingness to accept this new etiquette. A golden cup of wine was passed among the guests, and each man, after drinking, was expected to perform the prostration before receiving a kiss of friendship from the king. Most of the Persian nobles and a few courtiers complied with a practiced, fluid grace, their robes brushing the stone floor in a low, rhythmic movement. When the cup reached Callisthenes, he drank deeply but remained standing, approaching Alexander for the kiss without having performed the bow. The failure of the experiment was finalized when a member of the royal guard quietly informed the king that the philosopher had not prostrated himself. Alexander, noting the refusal, declined the kiss, to which Callisthenes reportedly remarked that he would simply go away the poorer by a kiss. This small, human-scale defiance resonated through the camp, emboldening the dissenters and marking the philosopher as a primary target for the king's frustration. The warmth of the old relationship had faded, replaced by a brittle administrative coldness that settled over the royal quarters. A deeper and more violent current of unrest had already manifested in the conspiracy of Philotas, the son of the veteran general Parmenion and commander of the companion cavalry. Philotas was a man of immense talent and even greater arrogance, whose habit of boasting about his own contributions to the victory had long irritated the king. In late 330 BCE, while the army was in Phrygia, a plot to assassinate Alexander was uncovered. Philotas was accused of having known of the conspiracy without reporting it. The trial was held before the assembled Macedonian troops, where the weight of the evidence led to a swift verdict of death. Philotas, the son of the man who had been the anvil of every Macedonian victory, was executed by the spears of his own soldiers in a dusty courtyard. This event presented Alexander with a grim, logistical necessity. He could not allow the father, Parmenion, to remain in command of the great treasury at Ecbatana while his son had been put to death. The administrative logic of the Argead house dictated that a father would inevitably seek vengeance for a son. Therefore, the father's life was also forfeit to the stability of the crown. It was a cold, calculated decision that marked the end of the old guard's influence over the campaign's direction. The command for the assassination of Parmenion was carried out with a terrifying mechanical efficiency that bypassed the traditional trial. Polydamas, a friend of the general, was dispatched across the desert on a fast dromedary, carrying secret letters that ordered the immediate execution of the old man. Parmenion was walking in the palace gardens, reading a letter he believed to be from his son, when the assassin struck him down amidst the scent of the evening roses. The silence that followed the general's death was one that the army felt in its very bones. No service, however distinguished, offered protection against the requirements of the new imperial order. Administrative life in the camp continued, but the atmosphere inside the king's tent had changed, becoming more formal and more prone to sudden atmospheric shifts of mood. In the city of Maracanda, during a night of heavy drinking, a heated argument broke out between Alexander and Cleitus the Black. Cleitus was the man who had saved the king's life at the Granicus, and he now stood as a vocal critic of the Persianization of the court. As the wine flowed and the rhetoric grew sharper, Cleitus began to praise the achievements of Philip II at the expense of Alexander. He suggested that the son's victories were built entirely upon the blood of the men his father had trained. Cleitus the Black reached for a piece of fruit, a small, tart apple from the local orchards. As he continued his tirade, his voice rising above the music of the flutes, he reminded the king of the day at the river when he had preserved the Argade line. The king, fueled by wine and resentment, seized a spear from a nearby guard and thrust it through his friend's chest. The sound of the struggle ceased almost instantly, replaced by the heavy, uneven breathing of the king as he looked down at the man who had once been his savior. This loss was more than the death of a friend. It was a fracture in the king's own sense of self. For 3 days, Alexander remained in his tent, refusing food or water and weeping for the man he had killed in a moment of drunken rage. The army eventually passed a formal resolution declaring that Cleitus had been justly executed for his insolence. This collective gesture allowed the king to emerge from his grief and resume his command. The warmth of the old fellowship had been permanently replaced by a pervasive, watchful fear. The page's conspiracy in 327 BCE provided the final justification for the removal of Callisthenes. A young royal page named Hermolaus organized a group of his peers to murder Alexander in his bed. The plot was discovered, and under torture, the pages implicated Callisthenes. They claimed the philosopher's teachings had encouraged their rebellious spirit. While there was no direct evidence of his participation, his refusal to bow had made his continued existence an administrative impossibility. The final days of the pages were conducted with a grim ceremonial finality, as they were stoned to death in accordance with Macedonian law. Callisthenes was placed in chains and carried with the army in a cage, eventually succumbing to illness or execution before the column reached the borders of India. The voice of the critic had been silenced, and the historian's pen was now firmly in the service of the king's own narrative. The transition was complete. The Council of Peers had become a court of subjects, and the king stood alone at the apex of a structure that he had built with both iron and blood. By the time the army reached the banks of the Indus, the internal shadow that had lengthened across the steppes of Central Asia had begun to settle into a permanent condition. The king moved with a new, quiet intensity, his gaze fixed on the horizon and his mind increasingly detached from the concerns of the men who followed him. The road to the east was open, but the army that crossed the river was no longer the one that had left Pella. They were the citizens of a new, shifting world, carried forward by the momentum of a machine that had learned to consume its own history. Chapter 13. The River of the World's Edge. The internal shadow that had lengthened across the steppes of Central Asia began to recede as the Macedonian column descended from the rugged heights of the Hindu Kush into the lush, humid valleys of the Kofun River. This transition was a movement from the sparse, high-altitude cold into a landscape of overwhelming fertility, where the air was thick with the scent of cedar, pine, and the damp earth of the riverbanks. For the soldiers who had spent years in the grey dust of the interior, the vibrant greens of the Indian frontier offered a psychological reprieve. They entered a world where the flora and fauna were entirely alien to the Hellenic experience. The descent was a slow, rhythmic progression through narrow mountain passes and wooded ravines. The sound of the march was muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles and the distant, persistent roar of mountain streams. Southward, the political geography was as varied as the terrain, consisting of a complex mosaic of independent hill tribes and wealthy, established kingdoms. Taxiles, the ruler of the great city of Taxila, recognized the administrative inevitability of the Argead advance. He sent an embassy to meet Alexander while the army was still in the highlands. He offered the king a gesture of formal friendship, including gifts of silver, several thousand sheep, and 30 elephants. This was the first significant encounter the Macedonians had with the animals that would soon define their experience of the East. This diplomacy secured a vital logistical base for the expedition, providing a secure harbor for the army. Throughout the valley of the Kofun, the army encountered the Aspasioi and the Asakanoi, tribes of fierce independence. They resided in fortified mountain citadels carved into the limestone cliffs. These campaigns were characterized by a density of siege work and small-scale engagements that tested the versatility of the Macedonian light infantry and the specialized Cretan archers. The air was often filled with the sharp, resinous smoke of cedarwood fires as the army constructed ramps and towers to reach these high-perched strongholds. It was during this period that Alexander was wounded in the leg by an Indian arrow. It was a reminder that the frontiers of the world carried a visceral, physical risk that no divine parentage could entirely mitigate. Taxila served as the primary gathering point for the army in the spring of 326 BCE. It was a city of immense wealth and intellectual vitality, located at the intersection of three major trade routes. The Macedonian officers moved through the bustling markets, observing the trade in fine muslins, iron of exceptional quality, and exotic spices that carried the warmth of the southern sun. Alexander himself found a particular interest in the gymnosophists, or naked philosophers of the region. These were men who practiced a rigorous asceticism and occupied themselves with the contemplation of the cosmic order. He sent his own philosopher, Winsicratus, to engage with them, initiating a quiet, cross-cultural dialogue that bridged the gap between the logic of the Lyceum and the meditation of the Indus. It was here that the king received word of the defiant posture of Porus, the ruler of the Parava kingdom. Porus had gathered a massive force on the far bank of the Hydaspes River. Porus was described by the scouts as a man of immense physical stature, standing nearly 7 feet tall, who commanded a professional army centered around a formidable corps of war elephants. The administrative challenge for Alexander was no longer the capture of a city, but the crossing of a wide, fast-moving river in the face of a concentrated enemy force. The logistics of the campaign began to center on the construction of a river fleet, utilizing the timber of the Himalayan foothills and the expertise of Phoenician and Cypriot shipwrights. The arrival of the monsoon season in early summer introduced a sensory element to the campaign that the Macedonians had never before experienced: the relentless, vertical rain of the tropics. The sky was a constant, leaden grey, and the air was so saturated with moisture that the bowstrings of the archers became slack and the leather of the sandals began to rot in the mud. The Hydaspes grew swollen and turbulent, its waters carrying the debris of the northern forests and making any crossing a maneuver of extreme danger. Alexander moved his camp along the western bank, keeping the army in a state of constant, rhythmic motion to mask his true intentions and to wear down the vigilance of Porus. Beyond the river, the Parava host remained stationary, their campfires visible through the sheets of rain and their elephants creating a wall of grey, breathing stone along the eastern shore. The sound of these animals, their low, guttural rumbles, and the occasional, sharp trumpet, carried across the water a persistent reminder of the physical barrier they represented. Alexander recognized that the horses of the companion cavalry would not charge the elephants, as the smell and the sight of the massive creatures would cause them to panic. The crossing would require a degree of tactical deception, and a specialized use of the infantry that the king began to develop in the quiet of his tent. Heavy rains provided the cover for the final decisive movement of the campaign in the summer of 326 BCE. Under a night of thunder and torrential downpour that silenced the noise of the army, Alexander led a selected force of 6,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry 17 miles upstream. They utilized a small, forested island as a staging point, assembling their boats and rafts in the dark, while the lightning flickered across the Punjab plains. The sound of the river's roar, amplified by the storm, acted as a natural veil for the clinking of armor and the low-energy commands of the officers. Under the cover of the pre-dawn mist, the first wave of the crossing began, the boats struggling against the swift current and the shifting silt of the riverbed. Alexander was among the first to reach the eastern bank, finding that what they had thought was the shore was actually another, smaller island. This necessitated a second, shorter crossing through chest-deep water. The men moved with a patient, focused intensity, holding their weapons high as they waded toward the muddy flats of the Parava kingdom. By the time the sun began to rise through the clouds, the Macedonian vanguard was established on the eastern bank, and the battle that would define the Indian campaign was in motion. Thunder and the splashing of mud provided the ambient soundtrack to the initial engagement, as Porus sent his son with a force of chariots to meet the landing. The soft, rain-soaked ground proved to be the undoing of the Indian vehicles, which became mired in the silt and were easily picked off by the Macedonian cavalry. Realizing that the main crossing was underway, Porus moved his entire army to a sandy plain where the ground was firmer. He positioned his 200 elephants in a long, imposing line in front of his infantry. The sight of this living wall was one that the chroniclers recorded with a specific, quiet awe, noting the colorful housings and the bronze-shod tusks of the great beasts. Immense, gray shapes began their slow, rhythmic advance as the Macedonian phalanx moved forward, their sarissa pikes leveled at the elephants' mahouts. The battle was a dense, visceral struggle that lacked the grand maneuvers of Gaugamela. It was a contest of individual stamina and the persistence of the light infantry. They utilized specialized axes and scythes to hamshackle the elephants. As the animals became wounded and panicked, they turned back upon their own ranks, creating a chaotic, trampling mass. The air was thick with the scent of blood, wet earth, and the pungent musk of the elephants, a sensory record of the most difficult victory the Macedonian machine had ever earned. Porus remained upon his own great elephant until the very end, continuing to fight even as his army disintegrated around him and he himself was wounded in the shoulder. He did not flee the field as Darius had done, but moved with a slow, dignified retreat toward the higher ground. Alexander, observing the bravery of his opponent, sent Taxiles and later another friend to invite the Indian king to a parley. When the two kings finally met, the contrast in their physical scale was noted by all present. The Macedonian prince on his horse and the Indian giant standing before him were covered in the dust and blood of the day. A quiet moment of dialogue between the two sovereigns followed, which would become one of the most celebrated miniatures in the history of the march. Alexander asked Porus how he wished to be treated, to which the Indian king replied with a simple, direct request. He wished to be treated as a king. When pressed for further detail, he stated that everything he desired was contained within that single phrase. This response, characterized by its lack of supplication and its appeal to a shared royal dignity, moved Alexander to not only restore Porus to his throne, but to expand his territory significantly. This encounter served as an interpretive pivot for the historian's voice, signaling a transition from the conquest of enemies to the recognition of peers. Alexander was increasingly acting as a king among kings, building a network of vassal sovereigns who were bound to him by personal respect rather than mere force. The administrative structure of the Punjab was established with Porus as the primary pillar of support, a move that stabilized the eastern frontier. However, the victory at the Hydaspes had come at a heavy physical and psychological cost, and the veterans were beginning to reach the limits of their endurance. Near the banks of the river, the king founded 2 cities to commemorate the victory: Nicaea, named for the Greek word for victory, and Bucephala, named in honor of his faithful horse. Bucephalus had died shortly after the battle, not from a wound, but from old age and the exhaustion of a decade of campaigning across 3 continents. The burial of the stallion was a moment of quiet, personal mourning for Alexander, who had ridden the animal since the gardens of Mysa. The city served as a permanent stone monument to the horse that had carried the king from the northern highlands to the edge of the Indian world. The monsoon continued to pour its heavy, warm rains over the camp as the army settled into the task of reorganization. They had reached the 5 rivers of the Punjab, and the rumors of the great Ganges and the massive empires of the east began to permeate the ranks. For the king, the Hydaspes was another milestone in a journey that had no natural conclusion. For the soldiers, it was a threshold of exhaustion that was rapidly becoming a wall. The sound of the rain on the tents was the only music that remained, a persistent, rhythmic reminder that the earth was vast and the path home was growing faint. Chapter 14: The Edge of the World and the Turn of the Tide. The 5 rivers of the Punjab, fed by the glacial melt of the Himalayas and the relentless rains of the summer monsoon, created a landscape of shifting silt and vast, unpredictable waterways. After the victory at the Hydaspes, the Macedonian column moved eastward through the kingdom of Porus, crossing the Aeacines and the Hydrotes with a persistence that was increasingly fueled by momentum. The air remained heavy with a warm, saturating humidity that turned the soldiers' leather armor into a soft, useless weight. It caused the grain in their supply sacks to sprout or rot within days. This was a territory of dense jungles and unfamiliar sounds, where the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the broad teak leaves provided a constant, wearying background to the march. Exhaustion began to manifest not as a sudden collapse, but as a quiet, pervasive erosion of the collective will within the ranks of the phalanx. 8 years had passed since the crossing of the Hellespont, and the veterans now carried the physical toll of thousands of miles of dust, mountain ice, and tropical fever. Their iron swords were pitted with rust from the humidity, and their Macedonian garments had long since been replaced by a patchwork of local fabrics and salvaged Persian silks. The distance from Pella had reached a scale that felt absolute, a psychological threshold where the memory of the northern highlands seemed more like a myth than a reachable reality. Rumors of the landscape beyond the next river, the Hyphasis, began to filter through the camp with a frequency that unsettled even the most seasoned officers. Local informants spoke of the great Ganges, a river so wide that the far bank was invisible, and of the Gangaridi and Presi empires that waited on the other side with thousands of war elephants. These accounts described a depth of civilization and a scale of military power that suggested the Indian campaign was not a final movement, but the beginning of an entirely new and more dangerous conflict. In the humid silence of the evening watch, the soldiers gathered to discuss these reports, their voices low and heavy with the realization that the king's ambition had no natural horizon. The banks of the Hyphus River, known today as the Bees, became the literal and symbolic limit of the Argead expansion in the late summer of 326 BCE. When Alexander ordered the preparations for the crossing, the army did not move with its customary mechanical efficiency. Instead, a stillness settled over the ranks, followed by the sound of men weeping in their tents. This was the first time the Macedonian machine had refused to engage its gears, a moment of profound administrative friction. The king summoned his generals to his pavilion, seeking to reignite their enthusiasm with the same rhetoric of glory that had served him from Troy to Egypt. Conus, a veteran commander who had led the phalanx through the most brutal sections of the Persian and Indian wars, stood forward to speak for the silent majority of the army. He did not address the king with the insolence of Cletus or the intellectual distance of Callisthenes, but with a quiet, devastating honesty born of shared service. The general observed that while the king's spirit remained tireless, the bodies of his men were broken. Their desire was no longer for more cities, but for the sight of their parents, their wives, and the hearths of their own land. He suggested that a leader who knew when to stop was greater than one who only knew how to proceed, a sentiment that was met with a low, rhythmic clapping of hands from the soldiers gathered outside the tent. Deeply affected by this collective refusal, Alexander withdrew into his private quarters and remained there for 3 days, refusing to see even his closest companions. He hoped that his absence would create a sense of guilt among the troops, or that their loyalty to his person would eventually overcome their weariness. However, the camp remained quiet, the only sound being the persistent rain on the canvas and the occasional, distant call of a river bird. The king eventually emerged and ordered a final sacrifice to determine the divine will regarding the crossing, receiving omens that he interpreted as a signal to turn back. 12 massive stone altars were constructed along the banks of the Hyphasis, each as tall as a siege tower, to mark the furthest point of the Macedonian advance. These structures were intended to serve as a permanent, physical archive of the expedition's reach, dedicated to the gods who had preserved the king through his long journey. Beside the altars, the soldiers left behind oversized armor and enormous bronze mangers for horses, a deliberate attempt to create a mythic scale for future generations who might stumble upon the site. This act of monumentalizing the retreat allowed the king to frame the return as a choice rather than a defeat, preserving the dignity of the crown as the march turned westward. The construction of a vast river fleet began at the Hydaspes, utilizing the timber of the Himalayan foothills and the labor of thousands of specialized craftsmen. Alexander envisioned a journey down the Indus to the Great Outer Sea, a maneuver that would allow the army to explore the southern reaches of the continent while moving toward the Persian Gulf. Nearchus, a childhood friend and a man of great administrative competence, was appointed as the admiral of this fleet. It eventually numbered nearly 1,000 vessels, including triremes, transport barges, and grain ships. The sound of the shipyards, the rhythmic soaring of wood, and the hammering of bronze filled the valley as the army prepared for its transition from a land force to a maritime expedition. Navigating the confluence of the Punjab rivers proved to be a task of significant physical danger, as the meeting of the waters created violent rapids and whirlpools. The fleet moved with a slow, cautious pace, the oarsmen struggling against the turbulence while the infantry marched along the banks to protect the column from the local tribes. Among these were the Malians, a fierce and independent people who occupied a series of fortified cities along the lower reaches of the Hydrotes. The campaign against them was characterized by a sudden, renewed intensity as the king sought to vent his frustration through the systematic reduction of the regional strongholds. During the assault on the Malian capital, Alexander grew impatient with the slow progress of the scaling ladders and seized a ladder himself, climbing to the top of the citadel wall. He stood alone on the battlements, a solitary figure in polished iron armor who became the primary target for every Malian archer in the vicinity. Rather than retreating back down the ladder, which had broken under the weight of the soldiers attempting to follow him, the king leapt down into the interior of the citadel. He landed amidst the enemy and fought with his back against a great sacred tree, holding off the Malians until he was struck in the chest by a heavy Indian arrow. The projectile was nearly 3 feet long, tipped with a broad iron head that pierced the king's breastplate and sank deep into his lung. As he collapsed, his guardsmen Peucestus and Leonatus managed to leap the wall and cover him with the sacred shield of Achilles, forming a human barrier against the Malian blades. The sound of the breach followed almost immediately as the Macedonian troops tore down the gates and moved through the city with a terrifying finality. Every living creature within the walls was put to the sword, a sacrifice of blood for the life of the sovereign. Surgery to remove the arrow was performed in the heat of the Malian summer, a delicate and agonizing process that required the physician Critodemus to cut deep into the king's side. The air in the tent was thick with the scent of blood and wine, while the army outside waited in a state of profound, silent grief. When the arrow was finally withdrawn, a rush of air and blood escaped from the lung, leaving the king in a state of near death for several days. Rumors of his passing spread through the fleet, causing a near mutiny of despair among the soldiers who could not conceive of a world without their leader. Recovery was a slow and visible process, as Alexander insisted on being carried onto a ship and sailed past the assembled troops to prove he was still alive. He lay on a couch on the deck, his face pale and his breathing shallow, yet he managed to raise his hand in a quiet gesture of greeting as the vessel drifted slowly downstream. The sight of the king brought a sudden, overwhelming roar of relief from the army, a sound that carried across the water and echoed through the jungle. This vulnerability served to bridge the distance that the proskynesis debate had created, reminding the veterans that their king was still the man who had shared the dust of the road with them. The journey down the Indus continued through the autumn of 325 BCE, as the landscape began to change from the lush greens of the Punjab to the arid, sun-bleached sands of the lower river. The heat became a persistent, physical weight, and the water of the river grew increasingly saline as they approached the delta. Administrative oversight for the fleet remained with Nearchus, who began to prepare the ships for the long, unknown voyage across the Indian Ocean toward the Persian Gulf. The king, though still weakened by his wound, spent his days studying the maps of the coast and planning the return march through the desert. Reaching the mouth of the Indus, the Macedonians stood at the edge of the great outer sea, observing the tides with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. The rising and falling of the water seemed like the breathing of the world itself, a final confirmation that they had reached the limits of the inhabited earth. Alexander took a small fleet out into the open water and offered sacrifices to Poseidon, casting golden vessels into the waves to mark the conclusion of his eastern exploration. The journey toward the rising sun had ended, and the road back to the heart of the empire now lay across the most dangerous terrain they had ever faced. Behind them lay the rivers and the jungles, a world that was already beginning to slip back into its own ancient rhythms. Ahead lay the Gedrosian desert, a landscape of salt and silence that would test the machine in ways that no army had ever survived. The turn was complete, and the movement was now westward, toward the cooling shadows of Babylon. Chapter 15. The Babylonian Evening. The absence of further lands to the east did not signal a period of rest, but rather the beginning of the most grueling logistical trial the Macedonian machine had ever faced. In the autumn of 325 BCE, Alexander divided his forces for the return journey, sending Nearchus with the fleet while he led the bulk of the land army through the Gedrosian desert. This was a territory that no previous conqueror, including the legendary Cyrus or Semiramis, was said to have crossed successfully with an army. The decision was driven by a desire to provide land-based support for the fleet, yet it led the veterans into a landscape of shifting salt dunes and sun-bleached silence, where the heat turned the air into a physical weight. Dust and heat became the primary adversaries of the march, as the column moved through a geography that offered no shade and very little water. The Gedrosian waste was a vast beige infinity where the horizon was a constant shimmering mirage, and the only sound was the dry crunch of sand. Provisions grew scarce as the baggage train became mired in the dunes, forcing the soldiers to consume the cattle intended for the journey's end. The administration of the march began to break down under the pressure of the environment. claiming the lives of thousands of camp followers and pack animals. A single, quiet moment in the heart of the desert provided a crystallizing image of the king's leadership during the height of the crisis. While the column was at its most desperate, a small group of light infantry found a tiny spring and managed to collect a few drops of water in a helmet. The king took the helmet, observing the parched faces of the men around him and the absolute stillness of the desert air. In a gesture of shared suffering, he poured the water out into the sand, refusing to drink what his soldiers could not also have. The sight of the precious liquid vanishing into the dry earth acted as a psychological anchor for the army, signaling that their sovereign remained tethered to their own physical reality. Relief arrived in the form of the fertile valleys of Chaeronea, where the army finally regrouped and found the water and grain they had lacked for 2 months. The transition from the silence of the desert to the relative luxury of the imperial heartland was marked by a series of celebrations and the arrival of Nearchus. The king and the admiral met in a moment of genuine, weary relief. Their shared survival, a confirmation that the maritime and land-based branches of the expedition could operate in coordination. Administrative oversight was quickly resumed as Alexander began to purge the satraps who had governed poorly or rebelled during his absence. Susa served as the setting for the next phase of the king's administrative vision, a project of cultural and biological fusion known as the Susa weddings. In early 324 BCE, Alexander and 80 of his senior officers took Persian brides in a grand state-sponsored ceremony intended to bind the ruling classes. The king married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, while his companion Hephaestion married her sister Drypetis. 10,000 common soldiers also received dowries to formalize their unions with local women, a move that sought to ground the empire's future in a hybrid generation. Resentment among the Macedonian veterans reached a tipping point at the city of Opis. The king announced the discharge of older and wounded soldiers to be replaced by Persian successors who had been trained in the Macedonian style. The army viewed this not as a gesture of mercy, but as a total abandonment of their ancestral traditions. They stood before the royal dais and called out for the king to dismiss them all. Alexander responded with a sudden, low-energy coldness, withdrawing to the palace and refusing to see them until the veterans eventually pleaded for reconciliation. Ecbatana, the cooling summer capital, became the site of the most significant personal loss of the king's life during the autumn of 324 BCE. Hephaestion, the friend who had shared the gardens of Mysa and the dust of India, fell ill with a sudden, lingering fever and passed away. The silence that settled over the royal quarters was absolute, as the king entered a period of mourning that bordered on the catastrophic. He ordered the sacred fires of the Persian temples to be extinguished and commissioned a funeral pyre in Babylon that was nearly 200 feet high. The return to Babylon in early 323 BCE was accompanied by a series of ominous signs that the seers and astronomers viewed with a growing, quiet alarm. Chaldean priests met the king at the gates and warned him not to enter the city from the east. Alexander attempted to follow this by circling the walls, though the marshy terrain eventually forced him into the original path. Despite these warnings, Alexander's mind remained focused on future projects, including the exploration of the Arabian coast and the reorganization of the navy. He spent his days in the royal palace, receiving embassies from as far away as Rome and Carthage, his gaze still fixed on the maps of the world's remaining edges. During a long evening of symposium and administrative planning, the king felt the first onset of a fever that would eventually silence the empire. He retired to his quarters in the garden palace of Nebuchadnezzar, where the air was thick with the scent of frankincense and the humidity of the Euphrates at midnight. For several days, he continued to issue commands and perform his daily sacrifices, but the illness persisted with a slow, grinding intensity. The palace was held in a state of suspended animation, the sound of the royal physician's footsteps the only constant in the limestone corridors. A quiet final march past of the veteran soldiers was permitted as it became clear that the king would not recover. The men who had crossed the Hellespont and the Hindu Kush were allowed to enter the royal chamber one by one, walking past the bed of the man who had led them for over a decade. Alexander was unable to speak, but he reportedly acknowledged each man with a slight movement of his eyes and a weary gesture of his hand. This silent acknowledgement of the ranks was the final act of the Macedonian machine, a moment of closure for the men who had been the physical instrument of his ambition. The end arrived in the early evening of June 11, 323 BCE, as the sun dipped behind the western walls of Babylon. When his generals gathered around the bed and asked to whom he left his kingdom, the king reportedly whispered the words to the strongest before falling into a final rest. The administrative center of the world was suddenly without a driver, and the silence that followed was recorded as a physical weight upon the city. The empire he had built was a structure of immense potential, but it was one that resided entirely within the force of his own will. Consequence and collapse followed almost immediately, as the generals began the long, violent process of dividing the provinces among themselves. The unified world that Alexander had envisioned began to fragment into the successor kingdoms of the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Antigonids. The body of the king was eventually taken to Egypt by Ptolemy, where it would rest in a golden sarcophagus in the heart of Alexandria. The chronicle of the man had ended, but the Hellenistic era he had initiated would continue to shape the textures of the Mediterranean and Asia for centuries. The movement of the history now draws toward its own rest, turning away from the high palaces and the dusty roads. The sound of the pikes against the shields has faded, and the heat of the Indian rains has long since dried. In the gardens of Babylon, the waters of the Euphrates continue their slow, predictable journey toward the sea, unaffected by the rise and fall of men. The air in the room is still, carrying only the faint, cooling residue of the day's thoughts as they reach their natural conclusion. The limestone walls of the palace remain in the moonlight, their shadows lengthening across the paved avenues where the smoke of the pyre has cleared. The maps of the East are rolled and placed in their caskets, and the horses in the royal stables have settled into the quiet of the night. There is a persistent, calm continuity in the landscape that exists beyond the reach of the spear, a condition of rest that settles over the stones and the river alike. The temperature of the desert night is a soft, unchanging thing, holding the memory of the march without the burden of the momentum. Across the plains of Assyria and the mountains of the north, the silence is a physical presence, a softening of the edges of the world. The names of the cities and the dates of the battles are held in the earth, and the journey has reached a point where there is no longer a need to proceed. The history has arrived at its final movement, and the voice of the chronicler trails off into the stillness of the evening. The weight of the crown and the iron of the sword are set aside, and the chronicle settles into the rest it has earned through the long centuries. The journey is complete. Rest well.